The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Caleb Whitlock rode onto Nathaniel Cross's land and told him he had 30 days to pay back every cent he owed or lose everything his late wife had ever loved. Whitlock didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode his black horse straight past the fence line Nathaniel had mended 3 times that winter, right up to the porch steps. And he sat there in the saddle, looking down at Nathaniel the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. 2 riders flanking him, men with no expressions and thick hands, and he pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and let it fall onto the porch boards like it was trash. 30 days, Cross, he said. I've been patient long enough. He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned the horse and rode back through the fence line, and one of his riders tossed clean out of the frozen ground on their way out, just to make a point. Inside the house, a little girl named Rose stood at the window watching. She was 7 years old and had not said a single word in 14 months. If you've ever had to watch someone take something from you and been powerless to stop it, you already know exactly how Nathaniel Cross felt standing on that porch holding that document. And if you've ever had to start over with nothing but your 2 hands and whatever courage you had left, then this story is going to feel very familiar. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Eliza Hartwell was 18 years old when she answered the advertisement, and she did it sitting at a kitchen table in Georgia with a candle burning low because they couldn't afford to waste oil, with her mother asleep in the next room and her stepfather's boots on the floor by the door where he'd kicked them off before passing out on the settee. She wasn't romantic about it. She didn't sit there dreaming of mountains or a handsome stranger. She sat there reading the same 3 lines she'd read 4 times already. Widowed rancher in Montana Territory seeks capable woman for marriage. Must be willing to work, honest reply only. And she thought capable. That word, capable, was something she could prove. She had been proving capable since she was 11 years old. She wrote the letter that night. 12 sentences. She told him she was 18, healthy, could cook and sew and manage a household. She told him she was not delicate. She did not tell him about her stepfather or the reason she needed to leave, because she didn't think a stranger needed to know the shape of her shame. She folded the letter and addressed it to the name printed at the bottom of the advertisement. N. Cross, Harlan Creek Station, Montana Territory. Then she set it on the table and went to bed, half convinced she wouldn't mail it in the morning. She mailed it in the morning. The reply came 6 weeks later, briefer than hers had been. I have a daughter, 7 years old. She lost her mother 14 months ago and has not spoken since. I run cattle on 400 acres in the mountains. The work is hard and the winters are hard. I don't make promises I can't keep. If you still want to come, write back and I will send the fare. Signed Nathaniel Cross in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper, like a man who wrote infrequently and with effort. Eliza read it twice. She noted what he had not said. He hadn't said the ranch was prosperous. He hadn't told her she'd be comfortable or happy, or that he'd treat her like a queen. He had told her about his daughter first, before anything else. Gava. She thought that said something about him, though she couldn't have explained exactly what. She wrote back in 2 sentences, I will come, send the fare. Fare arrived. 3 weeks later, she was on a train heading northwest with everything she owned in 1 suitcase and a hat box that held her mother's gloves and a small tin of sewing needles and thread, the last things her grandmother had given her before she died. The rest of her life she was leaving behind without a backward glance. And if that sounds hard to believe for a girl of 18, then you've never had the kind of life that makes leaving easy. Train ride took 4 days and deposited her at a station in a town that barely qualified as a town 2 streets, general store, a post office, and a livery stable operating out of what had once been a barn. It was the end of February, and the cold hit her the moment she stepped off the train. Different cold than Georgia cold, sharp in a way that felt personal, like the weather itself was sizing her up. She stood on the platform with her suitcase at her feet and the hat box under her arm and looked around at the people who had no interest in her whatsoever. And she thought, well, here it is. A man came toward her from the direction of the livery stable, taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know what she'd expected. She'd built no picture of him in her mind, which she'd done deliberately, because pictures in your mind were the fastest way to disappointment. He was maybe 35, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen considerable use. His face was weathered in the way that came from years outdoors rather than age, and he had dark eyes that moved to her and stayed there without wavering, which most men's eyes didn't do when they first looked at her. Most men's eyes did the whole slow look over, and she had learned to hate that. Stopped a few feet away. "Miss Hartwell?" "Mr. Cross." Looked at her suitcase. "That's everything?" "Yes." Picked it up without asking, and started walking toward a wagon hitched to 2 horses at the far end of the street. She followed him, matching his pace, which was faster than she'd anticipated. Nah. He put her suitcase in the back of the wagon bed and stood at the side of it waiting, and she climbed up herself before he could decide whether to offer a hand, because she'd rather climb than be helped by a stranger and find out later that he counted it as a debt. They rode out of town in silence for the first several minutes. The landscape opened around them in a way that made Georgia feel like a room. She was not prepared for how much sky there was, or how the mountains in the distance seemed both close and unreachable at the same time. She'd read about Montana. Reading about it and sitting in it were not the same thing. Finally, he said, "Rose won't talk. I told you that in my letter." "You did. I'm not saying it to warn you off her. She's not difficult, she's just..." He stopped, adjusted something in his jaw. "She watches everything. Doesn't miss much. She just doesn't talk. She ever before. She talked plenty." He said it like it cost him something. She was the loudest person in any room she was ever in. Eliza looked at the mountains. What was her mother like? The silence that followed was long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said Clara was practical, didn't waste words. Loved that land like it was a person. A pause. She'd have thought it was a shame, what happened to Rose. Clara didn't have much patience for things getting smaller than they needed to be. "You think Rose got smaller?" He thought about it. Which surprised her. Most people would have either said no defensively or yes sadly, but he actually thought about it before he answered. "I think she folded herself up," he said, "and I don't know how to unfold her." Eliza nodded. She didn't offer any assurances because she had none to give. She hadn't been around a grieving child before, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. Ranch appeared after an hour's ride, set back from the road behind a tree line of bare-branched cottonwoods. The house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, solidly built, though the porch railing on the right side was broken, and the front door needed paint, and one of the upstairs shutters hung at an angle that suggested hinge trouble. It was not a failing house. It was a house that had been let go of for a while by a man who had been surviving rather than maintaining. She saw the curtain in the front window move. Rose was sitting at the kitchen table when they came inside, her hands folded in her lap, watching the door with an expression that gave nothing away. She was small for 7, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's Eliza guessed finer features. Delicate jaw and long fingers and hair that had been brushed but not braided, which suggested someone had made an effort but didn't know how to finish. Nathaniel said, "Rose, this is Miss Hartwell. She's come to stay with us." Rose looked at Eliza for a long, unbroken moment, not unfriendly, not welcoming, assessing, with a thoroughness that reminded Eliza of something. Of herself, actually, at that age, in her mother's kitchen, watching her stepfather walk through the door for the first time. Eliza set her hat box on the kitchen counter and crouched down so she was at the girl's eye level, which was not something she'd planned. It just seemed like the right thing. She said, "I'm not going to pretend I know what things have been like here, but I'm not pretending to be something I'm not either. So we can just start from wherever we actually are." Rose looked at her with those serious, steady eyes and said nothing. Eliza stood back up. "That's fine. I didn't say you had to answer." Behind her, she heard Nathaniel exhale just barely, just a fraction. She thought, he didn't know what to do with that. The first 2 weeks were the kind of hard that doesn't announce itself. It was not dramatic hard, it was the grinding. Relentless kind. Cold fingers, at 5 in the morning kind that wears you down by inches instead of miles. Stove in the kitchen had a temperamental flue that smoked on windy days. Root cellar had a door that froze in its frame overnight and required force to open each morning. 2 ranch hands brothers, named George and Clem Pardee, were polite to her, in the way that people are polite when they're waiting to decide what they think, which meant they were helpful when it was convenient and invisible when it wasn't. Nathaniel was different. He was not warm, but he was consistent, which was better than warm in ways she knew how to value. He told her what needed doing without condescension. He answered her questions directly. When she made errors, burned the griddle cakes on the 3rd morning, mistimed the bread on the 5th, he did not sigh or look pained or make the face her stepfather had always made, the face that said "I told you so" without saying anything. Just said try again tomorrow and meant it and moved on. She did not expect to like him. She had not come here to like anyone. She'd come here to survive, which was a different project entirely. But she found herself noticing things about him. The way he sat with Rose at the table in the evenings and read to her from whatever book he was working through, not simplifying it, just reading at his own pace and trusting that Rose was following along. The way he never told the girl to cheer up or get over it or stop being sad. The way he let the silence between them be what it was. The house itself told her things, too. Clara's things were still everywhere. A pair of women's boots by the back door, a half-finished piece of needlework in a basket beside the armchair, a calendar on the kitchen wall that had stopped being updated at a date 14 months ago. Nathaniel hadn't removed any of it, which some people might have found morbid, but Eliza thought it was just honest. He wasn't pretending Clara hadn't existed. He wasn't rushing towards some idea of what a household was supposed to look like. What he was doing, she gradually understood, was holding his breath and hoping he could keep everything together long enough for something to change. She found the quilt on a Sunday. She'd been tasked with organizing the upstairs linen press, which hadn't been touched in a while and had descended into the kind of chaos that happens when a man does laundry by necessity rather than system. She was pulling things out and refolding them, making sense of what was in there, when she found it folded at the very back of the bottom shelf, wrapped in brown paper that had yellowed at the edges. Glicken. She unwrapped it carefully and knew right away, from the quality of the stitching and the deliberateness of the pattern, that this was not ordinary quilting. It was a wedding ring pattern, done in blues and creams and a particular shade of yellow-green that would have taken careful choosing, and whoever had made it had been genuinely skilled. There was damage, a long tear down one side panel, several places where the stitching had unraveled, and a corner that had been water-stained and had dried stiff. She brought it downstairs, and Nathaniel was at the table with paperwork and looked up when she came in. And when he saw what was in her hands, something happened to his face that she wouldn't have been able to describe to anyone but recognized immediately as a man trying not to feel something in front of a person he didn't entirely trust yet. Clara's mother made that, he said. She left it to Clara when she died. Rose used to drag it around when she was little. Used it like a blanket. He stopped. It got torn when we moved some furniture after the funeral. I meant to have someone repair it, but he stopped again. I can repair this, Eliza said. You sure? I've been sewing since I was 8. This is repairable. She turned it over in her hands, examining the damage carefully. Water stain is going to be the hard part. The tear I can match if I have fabric that's close enough. Said nothing for a moment. Then there might be fabric in Clara's sewing basket. She kept everything. The sewing basket was in his bedroom, and he retrieved it without asking her to come in, brought it out and set it on the kitchen table, and went back to his paperwork. She sat down and went through it. Clara had indeed kept everything, scraps, remnants, thread in 40 colors, buttons and needles and a bone thimble worn smooth on one side. And there, at the bottom of the basket, a small folded piece of fabric in that same yellow-green, a remnant Clara had saved from the original quilting. It wasn't enough. It would repair 2 of the damaged sections, but not the third. Eliza thought about it for 2 days. Then she went to her trunk and opened it and took out the extra fabric she'd brought from home, the cream-colored muslin she'd been saving, that she'd thought she might use for, she wasn't sure what. She'd just packed it because it was good fabric, and good fabric was not something you left behind. Close enough in weight and weave. She could dye a section of it with strong tea to approximate the aged tone of the rest of the quilt. It would not be invisible to an expert eye, but it would hold. She did not tell Nathaniel she was using her own fabric. She just did it. She worked in the evenings by the kitchen lamp after Rose had gone to bed and Nathaniel had gone out to do the final check on the animals, and she worked on it for 6 evenings straight. She did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as, this is what needs doing. Rose found her on the 5th evening. Girl appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her nightgown and bare feet. And Eliza looked up and said, without making it a big thing, you should have socks on. Floor's cold. She went back to her work. Rose padded across the floor and stood beside the table and looked down at the quilt. Her expression shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable recognition, and under the recognition, something much rawer. I'm putting it back together, Eliza said, not looking up. It'll take a few more nights, but it'll be whole again. Rose stood there for a long time. Long enough that Eliza's neck started to ache from the angle she was working at. Then the girl reached out and touched the yellow-green fabric, the piece that had come from Clara's basket, from Clara's own scraps. Her fingers were very still on it. That's from your grandmother's original fabric, Eliza said. Mother saved it. Rose's hands stayed on the quilt. She didn't look up. Go get socks, Eliza said. Then you can stay and watch if you want. Rose went. She came back in the heavy wool socks Eliza had seen hanging on the chair in her room. She pulled the other kitchen chair close to the table and sat down and watched Eliza work. Neither of them said anything. They sat like that for over an hour, the woman sewing by lamplight and the child watching, and when Nathaniel came in from outside and stopped in the kitchen doorway and saw them, he didn't say anything either. He just stood there for a moment. Then he went upstairs. Eliza heard him on the stairs and thought, something just shifted here. She didn't know what exactly, but something had. Quilt was finished on a Thursday morning, spread across the kitchen table in the early light, and she was honest with herself about this good work. Repairs were solid, and the color matching was close enough that unless you'd known where to look, you'd have had to search for the joined sections. Water stain on the corner had lightened considerably with careful treatment and was now a gentle fading rather than a blotch. Rose was the first one down that morning. She came into the kitchen and stopped and looked at it. Eliza watched her take it in. Then Rose picked it up both arms, the whole weight of it, and pressed her face into the fabric. She stood like that for a full minute. And then, in a voice that sounded rusty with disuse, barely above a whisper, she said one word, Mama. The word fell into the kitchen, and Eliza's chest did something that she had not been expecting and was not prepared for. A sudden pressure that nothing to do with sadness exactly, but was not entirely separate from it either. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window and breathed carefully through her nose. Nathaniel appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He had heard. Tell by the way he'd stopped moving. He was standing at the kitchen doorway looking at his daughter, and the expression on his face was not something Eliza was going to describe to anyone ever, because it belonged to him. Rose lowered the quilt and looked at her father. She said, It's fixed. Nathaniel said very quietly, Yeah, it is. She fixed it. Rose looked at Eliza. Nathaniel looked at Eliza too. He said, Yes, she did. Eliza busied herself at the stove. She put the kettle on and got out the coffee and made considerably more noise than the task required. Behind her, she could hear Nathaniel cross the kitchen floor, and the sound of him kneeling down and pulling his daughter in, and the sound of Rose broken and tentative and real beginning to cry. She made the coffee very, very slowly. She gave them as much time as the kettle would allow. By the time March arrived, the household had rearranged itself around her in ways she hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have predicted. Rose had not returned to the volume Nathaniel had described, the girl who had been the loudest person in any room, but she talked now, in her quiet way, steadily. She talked to her father in the evenings. She talked to Eliza in the mornings while breakfast was being made, short observations and questions about things she'd noticed. She talked to the horses when she thought no one was listening. Party Brothers had decided to like Eliza, which she knew because Clem started saying good morning to her by name instead of just nodding. And George asked her opinion on what to do with a section of fence he was repairing, which he could have figured out himself. It was the kind of social signal men in their position gave when they'd made up their minds about someone. Nathaniel had said nothing about the wedding. The arrangement had been clear in the letters. She'd come here to marry him. But the actual formality of it had not been discussed since her arrival, and she had not raised it. Partly because she'd been occupied with becoming useful, and partly because she'd been watching him. She was not going to marry a man she hadn't watched for a while. She had made that calculation before she'd ever stepped off the train, and nothing since had changed it. What she'd seen over those weeks was this: a man who kept his word, who did not make her feel like a purchase, who looked at his land with the particular kind of attachment that came from work rather than inheritance, who had loved his wife. She could see it in the way the house still held Clara's shape and had not stopped loving her just because she was gone. That did not scare her. She'd half expected it to. We were in the barn one afternoon when he finally said it. She was holding a lantern for him while he wrapped a foreleg on one of the horses that had taken a cut from the fence wire, and he was concentrating on the wrapping and not looking at her when he said, "We should probably talk about the wedding." "When you want to do it." "When you want to do it," she said. "That's not an answer. You have stronger feelings about it than I do." "Been stalling." He looked up then, briefly. "Not offended. Something closer to caught. I'm not stalling. I've had plenty of openings to bring it up. He looked back at the wrapping. "I didn't want to make you feel like it was a transaction. Way you arrived and everything." She considered that. I arrived understanding what the arrangement was. It doesn't mean, he stopped, started over. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He was quiet for a moment, then somebody more desperate. The honesty of that landed with some weight. She could have been offended. Found she wasn't. I am desperate, she said. I was desperate when I answered that advertisement. But I'm not going to act like it, and I'm not going to let it make decisions for me. Finished wrapping the leg, and stood and took the lantern back from her, and looked at her in the barn dim light for a moment. Then next Saturday. If that's agreeable. That's agreeable, she said. Went back to the house in the cold. Rose was in the kitchen, doing her lessons, and looked up when they came in. She must have read something in their faces. 'Cause she said, what happened? Nothing, Nathaniel said. Rose looked at Eliza. Eliza said, we're getting married Saturday. Rose looked between them. Okay, she said. Like this was information she was filing rather than news. Glan went back to her lessons. Nathaniel looked at Eliza above the girl's head, and she looked at him, and they were both briefly, privately trying not to smile. The first time that had happened between them. Wedding itself was not elaborate. Justice of the peace came out from town on Saturday. A man named Aldrich who smelled of pipe tobacco and conducted the brief ceremony with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had done this in barns and kitchens and at bedsides and considered all venues equally valid. George and Clem Pardee stood along the kitchen wall as witnesses. Rose stood next to Eliza and held the quilt she'd asked to, and no one had questioned it. Nathaniel put a ring on Eliza's finger that had belonged to his mother, a plain silver band that fit her left hand close enough. Said the words the justice prompted him to say, and he said them clearly and without hesitation, which she had noticed was how he did most things. She said hers. Aldrich pronounced them married and shook Nathaniel's hand and nodded to Eliza and accepted the cup of coffee she offered him before he left. That was it. She was Eliza Cross. Wife to a man she'd known for 6 weeks. Stepmother to a child who had begun, just barely, tentatively, the edges to let her in. She went and made supper. It was Saturday, and they had a chicken she'd been saving, and she made it properly, with potatoes and the dried herbs she'd found in Clara's kitchen stores. They sat around the table, the 4 of them, if you counted George and Clem, which she did because they'd made an effort, and ate and talked about ordinary things. The fence section, the horse's leg, whether there was weather coming. It was the most ordinary thing she'd done since arriving. She sat in it and found she was glad of it. Later, after Rose was in bed and the brothers had gone back to the bunkhouse, she and Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the quiet, and she thought, this is where it starts. Not where it ends, where it starts. Whatever this is going to be, it starts now. She did not say that out loud. She didn't think she needed to. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting at that table on their wedding night with the Montana cold pressing against the windows and the lantern burning low, was that in 3 weeks, a man named Caleb Whitlock would ride through the fence line and drop a document on the porch and set a clock running that would test everything they'd just begun. She didn't know it yet, but she was the kind of woman who would find out and not run. And that was going to matter more than she could have guessed. 3 weeks after the wedding, the document Whitlock had dropped on the porch was still sitting on the kitchen table because Nathaniel hadn't figured out where else to put it. He'd read it 4 times. The numbers didn't change. The language didn't soften. The 30-day deadline was printed at the top, in bold type, like a threat wearing a suit, and every morning Eliza watched him look at it while he drank his coffee and then look away. She understood that he was doing the thing men did when they were terrified. He was waiting for the problem to solve itself. It wasn't going to solve itself. She knew that already. Debt was real. Nathaniel had borrowed money 3 years ago from a lending firm in Helena that Whitlock had since purchased along with its outstanding notes. Which was, George Pardee explained it to her while she was hanging laundry on the 4th day after the document arrived, what Whitlock did. Found failing ranches with debt attached, bought the paper, and came calling. Most of the time the ranchers couldn't pay, and Whitlock got the land at a fraction of its worth and turned around and sold it to the railroad or the timber interests or whoever else was circling that particular territory. He'd done it to 4 other operations in the county in the last 2 years. He was efficient about it. He had a lawyer in Helena who made everything look legitimate, which it technically was, which was the worst part. How much does Nathaniel owe? Eliza asked. George looked uncomfortable. It's his business to tell you. I'm his wife. George looked at the laundry. $840, he said finally. That's what the note says. plus the interest that's accumulated. She kept hanging laundry. She did the math in her head. Against what she knew about the ranch's income from the previous season, what she'd been able to piece together from the account book she'd found in the desk, which Nathaniel had not hidden from her, but had not exactly invited her to read. It was not a number they could come up with in 30 days. Not honestly. Not without something changing significantly. She went inside and found Nathaniel in the barn and said, "Tell me exactly what we have." He looked at her. "Don't tell me not to worry about it," she said. "Tell me what we have," he told her. It took about 10 minutes, and by the end of it, they were both sitting on upturned crates in the cold barn, and she was doing arithmetic in her head, and he was staring at the ground. They had $60 in the household account. They had cattle they could sell, but the market was low this time of year, and they'd get poor prices, and selling the cattle was selling next season's income. George and Clem were owed wages. There were supply costs coming. When she'd laid it all out in her head, the gap between what they had and what they needed was somewhere around $600. Gone, she sat with that number for a minute like you'd sit with a stone you'd picked up and hadn't decided what to do with yet. "I have land," Nathaniel said. "Just not cash." "He doesn't want payment," she said. "Wants the land." Nathaniel said nothing because she was right. "He bought that debt specifically because he wanted this property," she continued. "He's not going to negotiate. There's nothing to negotiate with a man who set this up to win from the beginning." Nathaniel looked up. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm figuring out what's true before I start figuring out what to do." He looked at her for a moment. She couldn't entirely read his expression. Then he said, "You're not scared, I'm terrified," she said. "Doesn't mean I stopped thinking." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark listening to the wind come off the mountains and thought about the $600 the way you think about a wall you have to get over, not whether you can, but how. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she could do. She was a good seamstress. She'd known that her whole life, had learned from her grandmother, and then pushed past what her grandmother had taught her, because she had the kind of hands that understood thread and fabric in the same way some people understood numbers. She'd been sewing for 10 years. She could make garments, real garments, the kind that fit and held and lasted. She could make quilts and household linens. She could do repair work, the kind of careful, skilled repair that made damaged things look whole again. Georgia, that skill had been invisible, something women did, domestic and unvalued. She was not in Georgia. She was in a frontier territory where the nearest seamstress was 40 miles away, and the women in the ranching communities wore clothes until they fell apart because there was no alternative. She'd noticed this. She'd noticed it in the way women looked at her hands when she'd done simple mending at church, the month after she'd arrived, when Nathaniel had taken them into town for the service. She'd noticed it in the way Mrs. Coleridge from the neighboring farm had asked her, almost shyly, whether she thought she could do anything with a coat whose lining had given out, and Eliza had said yes and done it in an evening, and Mrs. Coleridge had looked at the finished work like she'd been handed in something precious. Something there. She just had to figure out how to turn something into $600 in 3 weeks, which was not a small problem, and she was not going to pretend it was. She got up before dawn, lit the lamp in the kitchen, sat down with a piece of paper, and started writing. By the time Nathaniel came downstairs, she had 3 pages of notes and a plan that was either very good or completely desperate, and she was not sure yet which one. She laid it out for him over coffee, watching his face as she went through it. She would take orders for custom sewing work garments, quilts, household goods, from every woman in the county she could reach. She would use her own materials where she had them and source more from the general store on credit against future payment. She would work every hour she wasn't needed for the ranch itself. Rose could help with the simpler tasks, hemming, button sewing, the kinds of things a 7-year-old with patient hands could manage. George and Clem could take orders into town when they went for supplies. She would also sell the 3 finished quilts she'd been working on for herself, the ones she'd started in the first weeks here as a way of keeping her hands busy, and she would start new ones immediately. Nathaniel listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He let you finish before he responded, which was rarer than it should have been. When she was done, he said, "That's a lot of hours." "Yes. You'd be working around the clock. I'd be working until this is settled." He looked at her notes. "Even if you got every order you're describing." "I know the math is hard," she said. "I'm not pretending it isn't. But something I can do. It's the only thing I can think of that doesn't involve selling the cattle or the land or something we can't get back." It was quiet for a while. The lamp between them made the kitchen feel smaller, warmer, closer than the morning deserved. Finally, he said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Help getting the word out. And don't tell me it won't work until we've tried." Said, "I wasn't going to tell you that." She looked at him. Wasn't. She could tell. "I was going to say," he continued, "that I'll go into town today. I know most of the ranching families within 20 miles. I know who needs work done and who can pay for it. I'll tell them." He picked up his coffee. There's work I can take on. Neighboring ranches sometimes need extra hands in winter for specific jobs. I can take on some of that. Don't have to. We're doing this together, he said. And the way he said it was not emotional. It was just factual, like stating the dimensions of a fence line. We're doing this together. As if the alternative was simply not a thing that existed in his understanding of the situation. Pressed her lips together for a moment. Then, okay, he said. Rose appeared at the bottom of the stairs in her nightgown, taking in the lamp and the papers and the two of them at the table with the particular radar children had for adult gravity. She said, "What's happening?" Nathaniel looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Rose and said, "We have a problem we're working on. Nothing you need to worry about this morning. Are you hungry?" Rose looked between them. She was quiet for a moment. Not the old silence, not the sealed-off silence of the first weeks, but the considering kind. Then she said, "I can help." Nathaniel said, "With what?" "Whatever you need," Rose said simply. "I can do things." Eliza felt something move in her chest. She said, "I know you can. Go get dressed, and I'll show you after breakfast." First orders came in faster than Eliza had expected. Nathaniel rode out on the Monday after their kitchen table conversation and came back that evening with 6 names and what those 6 households needed. Mrs. Parkhurst wanted a winter coat made over for her daughter, who had grown 3 inches since last year. Olmsted family needed 2 sets of work shirts for their sons. Adelaide Brennan, whose husband ran the grain operation west of town, wanted a proper Sunday dress. She'd had the fabric for 2 years and no one skilled enough to cut it. 2 more families had quilting requests. One had a wedding coming up in April and needed everything from the bride's dress altered to the table linens hemmed. Eliza looked at the list Nathaniel had written out in his heavy-handed script and did the mental calculation of hours against the payment she could reasonably charge for each piece and against the 23 days. She had left, and the numbers were not comfortable. But they were not impossible, not if she was efficient, not if she didn't sleep much. She started that evening. Kitchen table became her workspace. She cleared one end of it permanently and set up her sewing basket and her shears and the flat iron she'd heat on the stove for pressing seams. And she worked in the evenings after supper and again in the mornings before dawn. And on the days when the ranch work allowed her a longer stretch in the middle of the day, she worked then too. Rose sat with her sometimes and did the straightforward tasks running a hem on something already pinned, sewing on buttons with the neat, even stitches Eliza had shown her, rolling and pressing bias tape. Girl was careful and did not rush and ask questions when she was uncertain, which were 3 qualities Eliza valued above natural talent. Nathaniel rode out twice that week to take on work at neighboring operations. One day helping with a roof repair at the Olmsted place, and 2 days doing fence work for a man named Harker who ran sheep north of town. Came home tired both evenings, ate supper, and sat at the table across from Eliza while she sewed and told her what he'd heard in the county. What he'd heard was not entirely encouraging. "Whitlock's got people watching this," he said on the second evening. Kept her eyes on her work. "What do you mean, watching?" One of the Olmsted boys saw a man he didn't recognize riding the property line on the east side this morning. Whitlock's man, he thought. "Just watching. He's making sure we don't move the cattle or sell assets before the deadline," she said. "Doesn't want us liquidating anything he could claim." Nathaniel said, "Can he do that legally?" "I don't know. Probably not legally. But he doesn't need us to know what's legal and what isn't. He just needs us to feel like he's watching." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She saw it from across the table. She said, "Don't ride out to confront him, I wasn't. We were thinking about it." He said nothing, which was confirmation. "I want you angry," she said. "Angry men make bad decisions. You go out there and there's a confrontation, and suddenly he's got a legal excuse to accelerate the debt collection or claim you're interfering with his agents. Don't give him anything." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountain, the kind that came before a turn in the weather. He said, How do you know how to think about a man like this? She pulled a seam flat with her finger. I've known men like him all my life. Just smaller scale versions. Men who make everything look like procedure when what they're actually doing is taking. She set her needle. The only way to beat that kind of man is to not make a mistake he can use. Nathaniel looked at her across the table with an expression she was still learning how to read. He said, I'm glad you came. It was not something she'd expected him to say. It landed differently than a compliment. It was more like an acknowledgement of something he'd arrived at slowly and was only now putting words to. Kept her eyes on the fabric. Let's see how this turns out before you say that. I mean it now, he said, regardless of how it turns out. She didn't answer, but she heard it. Whitlock came back on the 14th day. He came alone this time, which surprised her. No flanking riders, no theater. Came up to the front door and knocked, which also surprised her, given that he hadn't bothered last time. Eliza answered it because Nathaniel was out in the north field, and she was the one closest to the door. He was a tall man, lean rather than broad, with pale eyes and an expensive coat and the kind of groomed mustache that told you he spent time on his appearance, which she'd found was often true of men who needed you to register their power visually because they couldn't project it any other way. He looked at her with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and entirely cold. Cross, he said, I was hoping to speak with your husband. He's not in, she said. You can speak with me. Something moved in his expression briefly, barely. He had not expected that. I'd rather wait for Nathaniel. I'm sure you would. What can I help you with? His pleasant expression reassembled itself. I wanted to see how the family was getting on, given the circumstances. We're getting on fine, she said. I'm glad to hear it. He looked past her into the house, not rudely, just enough to make clear he was noting things. She moved slightly, not aggressively, just enough to fill the doorway more completely. She saw him register that. I want you to know, he said, his voice taking on a confiding quality that she recognized immediately as performance, that I'm not an unreasonable man. There are options here beyond the deadline. Nathaniel and I could come to an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Well, he smiled. It was a practiced smile. If Nathaniel were willing to sign over the north acreage, the section along the creek, I could reduce the outstanding debt significantly. Perhaps enough that the rest could be managed over time. She looked at him steadily. The north acreage along the creek was the water source. Without it, the rest of the land was worth considerably less. A rancher without reliable water access was a rancher with a dying operation. He knew that. He was not offering a compromise. He was offering a slightly more gradual version of taking everything. I'll let Nathaniel know you came by, she said. He'll contact you if he wants to discuss it. Whitlock's smile didn't waver, but his eyes did something. A small, assessing shift. It was recalculating her. She could see it happening. He'd come here expecting to deal with a worried ranch wife who'd be either frightened or deferential, and he was finding something else. I'd encourage you both not to wait too long, he said pleasantly. Deadlines have a way of arriving before people are ready. We're aware of the deadline, she said. Thank you for coming by. She closed the door. Not slammed it, closed it, firmly, and stood with her hand on the latch until she heard his horse move away from the house. Then she went back to the kitchen table and sat down and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, which was all she was going to allow. Then she picked up her needle and went back to work. Rose came in from the barn where she'd been collecting eggs. She'd started doing this herself in the last week. Matter-of-factly picking up tasks around the property the way a child does when they've decided they live somewhere rather than just staying somewhere, and found Eliza at the table with her eyes focused very hard on her stitching. Who was that? Rose asked. A man named Whitlock. Rose set the egg basket down on the counter carefully. She was quiet for a moment. Then George says he's trying to take the ranch. Eliza looked up. George told you that? I heard him telling Clem. Didn't know I was in the stall. Rose turned and looked at her directly, with those steady eyes that didn't flinch from difficult things. Is that true? Eliza considered the various things you could say to a 7-year-old in this situation. She could soften it. She could redirect it. She looked at Rose and thought, this child has already survived the worst thing she will probably ever face. And she handled it by going silent for over a year. What she needs now is not protection. She needs to be told the truth. She's trying to, she said. We're trying to stop him. How? By earning enough money to pay what your father owes before the deadline. Rose looked at the sewing spread across the table, the coat she was recutting, the half-finished quilt, the stack of work shirts waiting to be assembled. She looked at it for a moment, with the expression of someone adding things up. Then she said, "That's why you're sewing all the time." "Yes. Is it going to be enough?" "I don't know yet." Rose nodded. She pulled out her chair and sat down and picked up the button sewing she'd left off the night before. She did it without being asked, without ceremony, just picked it up and continued. She worked in silence for a few minutes and then said, without looking up, "Mama used to say that the ranch wasn't just land. She said it was what we built with our hands, and that's what made it ours." Eliza was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Your mama was right." "I know," Rose said, and went on sewing. On the 16th day, Nathaniel came home from a job at the Harker sheep operation with $40 and a pulled muscle in his shoulder that he was trying not to show, which she noticed anyway and said nothing about directly. She made him sit and put a heated cloth on it after supper and told him the shoulder needed a day's rest. He said he didn't have a day. She said one day wouldn't kill the timeline, but ignoring the shoulder until it gave out completely might. And they had a short argument about it that was less an argument and more a negotiation, and he agreed to half a day. $40 went into the tin box she'd put on the kitchen shelf, which was their running account of what they'd accumulated so far. She counted it after he went to bed. They had $215. They needed more than $800. They had 14 days. Mathematics were not working. She sat at the table in the dark kitchen and let herself look at that clearly. Sewing work was coming in. More orders had arrived during the week, including 2 from women she hadn't met who'd heard from others that there was a skilled seamstress at the Cross Ranch and ridden out specifically to bring work. She was producing as fast as she could, but the timeline was the problem. Quality sewing took time, and you could not rush it without ruining it. And ruining it would cost her reputation, which was the only thing she was actually trading on right now. She could charge more. The thought had occurred to her, and she'd resisted it because she didn't want to price herself out of orders. Adelaide Brennan had said something the day before, when she'd brought in 2 additional projects. She'd said, almost offhandedly, "You could charge twice what you're asking. You know. No one within 40 miles does work like this." She'd said it without malice, the way a person says something obvious that they think you must already know. Eliza had filed that away. She was pulling it out now, in the dark kitchen, with the numbers spread before her in her head, and she was thinking about it hard. There was also the question of the quilts. She had 3 completed and 2 more in progress. She sold them not as simple household goods, but as finished artisan pieces. The kind of thing that townswomen bought to show off in their parlors rather than to use. She could price them higher. Adelaide Brennan had a parlor. She'd mentioned it. She'd mentioned it the way women mentioned things they wanted. Eliza got up and went to find a new piece of paper. She was still writing when Nathaniel appeared at the bottom of the stairs at 2 a.m, alerted probably by the lamp. He stood in the doorway looking at her. "You should sleep." "I will. I'm working something out." He came into the kitchen and looked over her shoulder at the paper. She'd been redesigning her pricing structure, recategorizing her work, drafting a simple notice she could send with George and Clem when they went into town, something that positioned what she was doing less as a frontier seamstress taking in work and more as a skilled craftwoman whose output was worth something. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's twice what you've been charging. Adelaide Brennan told me I was underpricing myself. Adelaide Brennan's husband made a lot of money in grain. Doesn't mean she's wrong about what things are worth." She turned to look at him. In the lamp glow, he looked tired, the good kind of tired, earned tired, the kind that came from doing everything you could with what you had. "I've been treating this like a favor I'm doing for the county," she said. "It's not a favor. It's skilled work, and skilled work has value. I should have been pricing it that way from the beginning." Quiet again. Then the quilt. "The one you made, the blue one you finished last week. What about it? What were you going to sell it for?" She'd been thinking $4. She said $4. Shook his head once. "I saw a quilt half as well made sell for $12 at the Missoula market 2 years ago. Clara's mother sold one for $15 once." Eliza looked at him. 15. She looked back at her paper, picked up her pencil and changed the number. Then she looked at the whole picture again, with the revised figures, and something shifted. Not completely, not enough to say they were safe, but enough that the wall didn't look quite as straight and solid as it had an hour ago. "Still need more," she said. "I know. I've been thinking." He sat down across from her. "There's a man in town, Franklin Marsh. He runs the lumber yard. He's been trying to find someone to take on a contract job hauling timber up to the valley settlement. 10 days of work, hard work, Pays $25 up front and $25 on completion. Take you for 10 days. 11, maybe 12. She thought about what 12 days alone on the ranch meant. She and Rose and the Party Brothers in a Montana February, with Whitlock's people watching from the property line. She thought about whether she was afraid of that. She decided she wasn't. Or rather she was, and it didn't matter. Take it, she said. Sure? Take it. We need the $50, and we need you not to sit here watching me sew for 10 days, because you'll go out of your mind and you'll be more useful working. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. It was the tired kind, but it was there. Said, I don't know what I expected when I sent that advertisement. Said that before. I mean it more now than I did before. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, go to sleep. You need the shoulder to heal. He went. She turned back to her paper. She sat there in the quiet kitchen with a lamp burning and the cold pressing at the windows and outside the moon coming and going behind cloud cover, and she thought about Adelaide Brennan and her parlor and the quilt priced at $15. And then she thought about all the women in this county who were wearing coats that didn't fit and dresses cut from fabric that deserved better and household linens that had gone past their useful life. She thought about what it meant to do something well in a place where it was needed. She had 14 days. She had a husband who was going to take a timber contract to earn $50. She had a 7-year-old sitting beside her in the evening sewing buttons with careful, even stitches. She had hands that knew what they were doing, and a pricing structure she was going to correct in the morning, and a stubbornness she'd been carrying since she was 11 years old that had never once done her wrong when she'd let it work. She was not going to let Caleb Whitlock have this ranch. She folded up her paper, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Nathaniel left for the timber job on a gray Thursday morning, and the first thing that happened after he rode out of sight down the mountain road was that Clem Party came to the back door and said the east fence line had a break in it, which meant a section of the herd had drifted overnight. She sent George out to round them back and told Clem to start on the fence repair, and then she went back to the kitchen table and picked up her needle, because problems didn't wait for convenient timing, and neither did deadlines. Days that followed fell into a rhythm that was almost mechanical, not because they were easy, but because she imposed structure on them the way you build a fence, post by post, because the alternative was chaos, and chaos was expensive. She was up before light. She made breakfast, got Rose fed and started on lessons, checked in with George and Clem about whatever the day's ranch work required. Then she sewed. She sewed until her fingers ached. She sewed through the afternoons and into the evenings, and Rose sat with her most evenings, and they talked sometimes and were quiet other times, and it was, she would have said, if anyone had asked, the most concentrated stretch of work she'd done in her life. And also, strangely, not an unhappy one. Word of the revised pricing had gone out with George on his Tuesday run into town, and she'd braced for orders to slow down, but they hadn't. 2 new customers had come in the first 3 days, women she'd never met who'd ridden from farther out and had apparently decided that the quality was worth the price. Adelaide Brennan had commissioned the blue quilt for her parlor at a price Eliza had once thought was impossible to ask for, and had paid a deposit on 2 more. On the 6th day without Nathaniel, a woman arrived at the door whom Eliza had never seen before. She was older, maybe 60, maybe more, with a solid build and gray hair pinned back severely, and the kind of face that had seen a great deal and organized it all into an expression of permanent practicality. She was driving her own wagon, and she drove it with the confidence of someone who had driven wagons in all conditions for most of her life. She tied the horse at the post and came to the front door and knocked with the particular authority of someone who expected to be answered. Eliza answered it. The woman looked her over, not rudely but thoroughly. Then she said, "You're Eliza Cross, I am. I'm Evelyn Marlowe. I have the operation south of the Harker land, past the second ridge. You wouldn't have seen me yet. I don't get to this end of the valley much in winter." She said it all matter-of-factly, establishing coordinates. "I heard about what you're doing." "The sewing?" "All of it." Evelyn Marlowe looked at her steadily. "I heard about Whitlock's note. I heard about what you've been doing to fight it. I heard from Adelaide Brennan and from June Olmsted and from Harker's wife, who sent me a letter last week." She paused. "Can I come in?" Eliza stepped back from the door. They sat at the kitchen table, Eliza on one side, work spread around her, and Evelyn Marlowe on the other, with her coat still on and her hands flat on the table in front of her. Rose had retreated to the window seat, quietly, the way she did when adults arrived, but she was listening. Eliza had given up trying to send her out of rooms. Evelyn Marlowe looked at the work on the table. She picked up the edge of the coat Eliza had been recutting and examined the seam with the eye of someone who knew what she was looking at. She set it back down. "I was a mail-order bride," she said, 30 years ago. "Came out here the same way you did, answered an advertisement, got on a train, showed up not knowing whether I'd made the worst decision of my life." She said it without drama, like it was just geography. "My husband's been gone 8 years. I run the operation myself now." Eliza waited. "I know what it is," Evelyn Marlowe said, "to arrive somewhere with nothing but your own capability and have to prove you're worth keeping." She looked at Eliza directly. "I know what Whitlock does. I watched him do it to the Brody family 3 years ago. They were gone in a month. Good people. He didn't care." "I know," Eliza said. "I've been watching what you're doing," Evelyn Marlowe said. "And I want you to know." She stopped, just briefly, and there was something in that pause that was not hesitation exactly, but more like someone deciding to say the true thing rather than the careful thing. "I want you to know that you're not alone in this county. There are women in this valley who understand exactly what's at stake when a family like yours gets pushed out. Because most of us built something from nothing too, and we remember what that cost." She folded her hands. "I didn't come here to offer you sympathy. I came here to tell you that if you find yourself short at the end of it, come to me." Eliza looked at her carefully. "What does that mean?" "Means I have money," Evelyn Marlowe said plainly. "I've been saving for 30 years and my children are grown and gone, and I have no debt and more than I need. It means that if you get to the deadline and you're still short by $100 or $200 or whatever it is, I will make up the difference. As a loan if your pride requires it. As a gift if you'll allow it." Kitchen was very quiet. Rose on the window seat had gone completely still. Eliza sat with what had just been said. She was aware of the tightness in her chest that was not grief but was related to it. The feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing you and choosing to show up anyway. She said, "Why?" Evelyn Marlowe said, "Because 30 years ago I arrived on a porch in this territory with one suitcase and I needed someone to tell me I wasn't alone. Nobody did, and I managed anyway. But it was harder than it needed to be, and it left marks." She met Eliza's eyes. "I'm not letting that happen to another woman, if I can help it." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope we don't need it." "I hope so too," Evelyn Marlowe said. "But the offer stands regardless." She stayed for an hour. She drank coffee and looked at Eliza's work and talked with Rose directly, comfortably, the way older women talked to children when they respected them. And when she left, she shook Eliza's hand at the door, which was not a thing women usually did, drove her wagon back down the mountain road without looking back. Eliza closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Rose appeared from the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "She was a mail-order bride too," Rose said. "Yes." Rose thought about that. "Like you." "Yes, she seems like she's fine," Rose said. Eliza looked at her daughter, her stepdaughter. The word felt insufficient and said, "She's more than fine." She went back to the kitchen table, picked up her needle. Her hands were steadier than they'd been all week. She had 9 days left. She had $215 in the tin box. She had a quilting commission from Adelaide Brennan, 6 garment orders in various stages of completion, and a 7-year-old sewing buttons on a work shirt with careful, even stitches. She had Evelyn Marlowe's offer sitting in her back pocket like a last resort she was determined not to need. She had a husband coming back in 5 days with $50 and a hauling job in his past and hopefully a healed shoulder. She had 9 days and she was not done yet. Nathaniel came back on a Wednesday evening, 5 days after he'd left, which was 2 days earlier than expected. Eliza knew something had happened before he even got off the horse, because of the way he was sitting in the saddle too straight. Kind of straight that was controlled rather than natural, the posture of a man holding something together by force of will. She came out to the barn while he was unsaddling the horse, and she stood in the doorway and waited. Didn't say anything for a moment. He pulled the saddle off and set it on the rack and ran a hand down the horse's neck, and then he said, without turning around, "Marsh cut the job short. Timber delivery got rerouted. The Valley Settlement found a closer supplier. Paid me for the days I worked." He paused, $31. "Not 50, 31. She did the math in her head in about 3 seconds. She did not let what she found there show on her face. "Come inside," she said. "Supper's been keeping." He turned then and looked at her. Then she could see he was waiting for something, a reaction. Recalculation. Some sign of how bad this was. She said, "Come inside, Nathaniel. It's cold." They ate supper, the 3 of them, and George and Clem at the other end of the table as they usually did. And nobody talked about the timber job or the deadline or Whitlock, because Rose was at the table, and the food was hot, and sometimes the most important thing you could do was eat a meal like a family. Rose talked about the eggs she'd been collecting, and a ewe that had been behaving strangely in the south pasture, and a book she'd been reading by lamplight, and Nathaniel listened to her with the full attention he always gave her when she talked. And Eliza watched both of them across the table and thought, whatever happens, this part is real. This part nobody can take. Later, after Rose was in bed, and the brothers had gone to the bunkhouse, Nathaniel sat down at the kitchen table across from the tin box, and Eliza sat down across from him, and she opened the box and counted it out on the table between them. Coins and bills made a pile that was not impressive to look at. Counted it twice and then looked up. $308, she said. 7 days left on the deadline. They needed more than $800. Number that lived between those two facts was $500, and it sat on the table between them as real and solid as anything in that kitchen. Nathaniel looked at the pile. He said, I've been going through it in my head the whole ride back. I can sell 3 of the steers, not the breeding stock, the others. At current market, I'd get maybe $60 for the 3 of them. Maybe $65. That brings us to $370. There's the wagon, he said. The old one in the back of the barn, the one we haven't used since. He stopped. Clara's father built that wagon. But it's a good one, and I could get $40 for it if I found the right buyer. $410, she said. The silver candlesticks in the parlor. Those were your mother's. I know what they were. He said it quietly, not harshly. He was just being accurate. A man in town deals in estate goods. Give me 15, maybe 20. $430, she said. They sat with $430 and $400 still to find, and the kitchen was very quiet. The stove was burning low, and the wind outside had picked up, the kind that came off the mountains and found every gap in the window frames, and reminded you that the house was made of wood and good intentions, and winters out here did not negotiate. She said, I have 7 orders I haven't delivered yet. When I deliver them and collect, she had the number already. She'd been running it all week. That's $63 at the new pricing. Maybe $68 if Adelaide Brennan adds to her commission, which she mentioned she might. $500, he said. Give or take. He looked at the pile. Still $300 short, I know, even with Evelyn Marlowe's offer. I don't want to use her money, Eliza said. It came out more firmly than she'd intended. She adjusted her tone. I want that to be the last resort. Not the first plan. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because if we use her money to solve this, then what we built here was partly built on what she gave us. She stopped. I want what we keep to be ours. Earned. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. He said he stopped. Rubbed the back of his neck. That's not wrong, but it might be too proud. Maybe, she said, but let me keep trying for the next 4 days before we decide it's too proud. He was quiet, then 4 days. 4 days, she agreed. She picked up her needle from the table where she'd set it down when she'd gone out to the barn. She threaded it in the lamplight with the steadiness of long practice. Nathaniel watched her for a moment, then got up and went to the shelf where he kept his account books, and pulled one down, sat back at the table, and they worked in silence across from each other for 2 hours without speaking. Just the scratch of his pencil and the pull of her thread and the stove burning down between them. Next morning she was up before 4. She had not slept well, and she had not expected to. But lying in bed doing arithmetic in the dark was less useful than sitting at the table doing it by lamplight, so she got up. She lit the lamp. She sat down with a fresh piece of paper and she wrote at the top, "What else?" She stared at those 2 words for a while. She'd been through her own inventory a dozen times already. She'd been through the ranch's assets with Nathaniel. She'd thought about the sewing orders and the pricing and the quilts and the timeline. She'd thought about everything she could think of inside the box she'd been thinking inside. She needed to think outside it. She wrote, "What does this county have that it can't get easily?" She wrote, "What can I do that no one else here does?" She wrote, "Who hasn't been asked yet?" That third question was the one. She looked at it for a long time. The women she'd been working with were mostly ranching wives, the farming and cattle families who were her nearest neighbors. But the town itself she'd barely touched. She'd sent a notice with George, but a notice was not the same as showing up. She thought about the town 2 streets, general store, the post office, delivery, and a collection of other businesses she'd cataloged in her memory from the 2 times she'd been there. There was a hotel. Hotels needed linens. There was a boarding house she'd noticed on the 2nd street, a two-story building with a sign she hadn't read closely. Boarding houses needed linens, too. There was a dressmaker's shop, she'd noticed it, but the woman who ran it had been closed both times Eliza had passed. She wrote, "Town linens, hotel, boarding house." She thought about what it would take to walk into a hotel and offer to supply their linen needs, and what kind of person she would need to be to do that. She thought about whether she was that kind of person. She decided she was going to be, starting today. She wrote, "Ride in today." "Don't send George, go yourself." She folded the paper. She went and put the kettle on. She stood at the stove in the dark kitchen while it heated, and she thought about Evelyn Marlowe and what the woman had said. "You are not alone in this county." And she thought about the fact that Evelyn Marlowe had made a life and a working ranch, out of the same raw material Eliza had arrived with. Same raw material. 30 years of working it into something solid. She was not going to need 30 years. She was going to need 4 days. She rode into town alone that morning, which she hadn't done before. She was aware of it, the strangeness of it, the openness of the mountain road with no one beside her, but it was not uncomfortable strangeness. It was the kind that came from doing something new and finding out you could do it. The hotel was called the Harlan Mountain Inn, which was a generous name for a two-story building with 6 rooms and a dining area that served breakfast and supper to travelers and some of the wealthier local men who came in for business. She tied her horse at the post and went in through the front door and asked at the desk for the proprietor. The proprietor was a woman, which she hadn't expected. Her name was Dorothea Wells, and she was somewhere around 50, with efficient eyes and the air of someone who'd been running things for a long time without assistance. Upton. She came out from the back when the desk boy fetched her, and she looked at Eliza with the brisk appraisal of a person who didn't have time for anything that wasn't useful. Eliza said, "I'm Eliza Cross. I do skilled sewing work garments and household goods. I've been told your linens could use replacing." Dorothea Wells said, "Who told you that?" "Nobody. I'm guessing because every hotel in every town I've ever been in needs its linens replaced more often than it does. Wear out and they get stained and replacement takes effort, so it gets put off." She paused. "I'm offering to make that easier." Dorothea Wells looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me your hands." Eliza held them out. Dorothea took them both, turned them palm up, looked at the calluses and the needle marks and the staining on her fingertips from the fabric dye she'd been using. She let go. "Come back here," she said, and turned and walked toward the back of the hotel without checking whether Eliza was following. The linen closet was, as Eliza had guessed, in a state that would have embarrassed a more fastidious proprietor. Sheets mended past their useful life, pillowcases with thin spots that would become holes by spring, toweling that had gone rough and sparse from too many washings. Dorothea Wells pulled things out and showed them with the lack of defensiveness of someone who knew what she had and had simply not gotten around to fixing it. "I need 20 sets of sheets," Dorothea said. "New. I need 8 dozen toweling squares. I need 12 new pillowcases." She looked at Eliza. "What's that going to cost me?" Eliza did the math in her head yardage labor timeline and gave her a number. Dorothea looked at it like she was finding the edges of it. "When could you have it done?" "I can't have it all done in a week," Eliza said honestly. "But I can do 10 sets of sheets and the toweling in a week. Rest in 2 weeks after that. I'll pay half now and half on delivery of the first batch," Dorothea said. "And if the quality's there, I'll give you the pillow order as well." Shook hands. Dorothea went to a lockbox behind the desk and counted out the deposit, $32, and handed it to Eliza without ceremony, the way business people handled things when they'd decided. Eliza walked out of the Harlan Mountain Inn with $32 in her coat pocket and found that her hands were not shaking, which surprised her a little because they probably should have been. She was not done. She crossed the street. Boarding house on the 2nd Street was run by a man named Ira Felton, who was not interested in linens and was in fact rather short about being interrupted in the middle of his morning accounts. Next to the boarding house was a tailor's shop, not a seamstress, a tailor, a man who did men's suits and work clothes, and the tailor, a thin Hungarian man named Victor Sabo, who had been in the territory for 12 years, looked at her when she introduced herself, and then looked at the garment she'd thought to bring as a sample, a child's coat she'd remade from an adult one. "I seem clean. Every line intentional," and he said, "You do women's work only." "I do everything," she said. He was quiet. He went to a back room and came out with a bolt of wool suiting material and a paper pattern and said, "I have 6 orders for women's riding habits. My wife did women's work, but she's been unwell this winter. If you can make up 2 of these to the measurements I have on file." He showed her the file. Measurements were detailed and accurate. Someone who knew what they were doing had taken them. I'll pay you $14 each for the 2 completed habits. $28. For 2 garments she could construct, given her skill level, in a day and a half each. She said, I'll have them to you by Saturday. D. He nodded and handed her the pattern and the fabric, and she carried it out to her horse and tied at it and stood in the street for a moment looking at the buildings around her. The general store, the post office, a small hardware operation, the cafe that was just opening its shutters for the morning, and she thought, I have been approaching this too small. She went into the general store. The general store owner was a man named Percy Dunbar, who had the pleasant, watchful quality of a person whose business depended on knowing everything that happened in the county. He knew who she was before she introduced herself. She'd been in twice before with Nathaniel, and he said, Mrs. Cross, what can I do for you? She said. I need to buy fabric on credit against future delivery. I'll give you first right to sell my finished quilts in your store at a commission. Percy Dunbar looked at her. Then he said, What kind of commission? 10% of sale price. 15.12. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. 12, he said. What quilts are we talking about? She told him. She had 3 completed and 2 nearly finished, and she could finish 3 more in the next week if she had the material. Looked at her, the way merchants looked at things they were calculating value on. Then he said, Adelaide Brennan bought one of yours last week. She did. She showed it to 6 people. He paused. I'll carry them. You have the 2 that are done available now? Not the ones commissioned. I have one available. Bring it in. I'll price it at $18. She had been going to price it at $15. She did not show what that number did to her face. She said, I'll bring it in tomorrow. She left the general store with a credit arrangement, and Percy Dunbar's handshake and $18 she didn't have yet, but was going to have by tomorrow afternoon. And she stood at her horse in the cold street and did the arithmetic in her head with all the morning's numbers added in. Deposit from Dorothea Wells, $32. 2 riding habits from Victor Sabo, $28 on delivery Saturday. Quilt at Percy Dunbar's, $18 tomorrow. Plus the 7 outstanding orders she was delivering over the next 3 days, $63 at minimum. That was $141 in the next 4 days. Added to the $308 in the tin box, and the steers Nathaniel was selling this afternoon, which was $60. She was looking at $509. $509. She needed more than $800. Still nearly $300 short, and she had 4 days to the deadline. She untied her horse. She stood in the street, with the cold finding its way through her coat, and she let herself look at that number $300, the way you looked at something that was real and that you had to deal with. She was not going to pretend it was smaller than it was. She was not going to pretend she wasn't frightened, in the back of her chest where she kept the things she didn't show. She rode home. Nathaniel had sold the steers. Gotten $58, which he told her when she came in, and she told him about the morning, and they sat at the table and did the arithmetic together. When they got to the end of it, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said $300, give or take. Looked at the table. He said the North Acreage. No, Eliza, that's the water source. If we sell or sign over the North Acreage, we're crippling the operation for whatever we have left of it. We'd survive the debt and lose the ranch a slower way. She shook her head. Not that. He put his hands flat on the table. She could see he was working through things the way he did, methodically, honestly, not rushing to conclusions. Said, there's the breeding stock. The breeding stock is next year's income. I know, Nathaniel. I know, he exhaled. I'm trying to find something. I know you are. They sat in the silence of 2 people who have run out of easy options and are trying to find the will to look at the hard ones. Rose appeared from the hallway. She'd been doing lessons at the writing desk in the front room. She looked at both of them. She said, is it bad? Nathaniel said, we're working on it. Rose came into the kitchen fully and sat down in her chair. She had a piece of paper in her hand that she set on the table. Eliza looked at it. It was a list, written in Rose's careful, slightly irregular 7-year-old handwriting. Top it said things we have. Below it 4 horses, not counting the ones sold. Barn. Mama's sewing basket, the quilt fixed. 2 dogs. Chickens 14, the south field planted for spring. Root cellar with stores. George and Clem. And at the bottom, underlined twice each other. Eliza looked at that list for a moment. Then she looked at Rose. Rose said, I thought if we wrote down what we have, it might help figure out what we're missing. Nathaniel picked up the paper. He read it. He set it back down very carefully. He said to Rose, that's good thinking. George said the root cellar stores are worth a lot, Rose continued. He said we have more preserved food than most ranches because Mama used to put up a lot in summer. Said a family in town might buy some if they were short. Eliza looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her. She's right, he said slowly. We have more than we'll use before the next harvest. Preserved vegetables, the dried goods, we could sell what we don't need. How much? Eliza asked. I don't $20. Maybe $30 if I find the right buyers in town. It was not $300. It was not even close to $300. It was something, and something mattered. She reached across the table and put her hand over Rose's. The girl looked up. Eliza said, That was smart, thank you. Rose said, Are we going to be okay? The question sat in the kitchen with all three of them. Eliza thought about the honest answer and the kind answer and whether they were the same thing. She said, We're going to do everything we can, and we're not alone in it. Rose nodded. She seemed to accept that, not because it was reassuring, but because it was true, and Rose had a 7-year-old's unnerving ability to tell the difference. Next 3 days moved at a pace that felt nothing like time and everything like water relentless, finding its own level, indifferent to what you wanted from it. Eliza sewed through the nights. She finished the 2 writing habits for Victor Sabo by Friday evening and delivered them Saturday morning and stood in his shop while he examined them seam by seam with the thoroughness of a craftsman checking another's work. And when he was done, he said, These are correct, which was not a compliment, but was clearly the highest thing he offered. He paid her $28 in cash without rounding or ceremony. She delivered the outstanding orders over Saturday and Sunday. Mrs. Parkhurst cried when she saw the coat. It fit her daughter perfect, which the original had not, and Mrs. Parkhurst said, I've been trying to get this done for 2 years. And Eliza felt the $63 she collected across all 6 deliveries as something more than money, though it was also very much money, and she needed it to be money right now. Nathaniel sold the stored goods from the root cellar. He rode into town Saturday morning with a loaded wagon and came back with $24, and the news that Dorothea Wells had bought most of the preserved vegetables herself for the hotel's kitchen, and had sent word through Nathaniel that if Eliza needed any additional time on the hotel linen order, she had it. Eliza sent back word she didn't need additional time. Counted the tin box on Sunday evening, 3 days before the deadline. $622. She sat with that number. Nearly $200 short. She had the quilt at Percy Dunbar's store $18, which Percy had sent word was already drawing interest from a buyer, and she had the hotel linen deposit already counted in. She had the 2 additional quilts she was working on, but those would not be done before the deadline. $200. In 3 days, she could ask Evelyn Marlowe. She sat with that thought. She'd been sitting with it for days, picking it up and putting it back down. It was not pride exactly. Or it was pride, but not the shallow kind, not the kind that was about appearances. It was something deeper. The sense that what they built here needed to be built by their own hands, or it was not entirely theirs. She understood that was not a perfectly rational position. Nathaniel had told her gently, twice, that there was no shame in accepting help. She knew he was right. She also knew that she was going to keep trying until the last possible moment before she accepted it. Picked up her needle. She kept working. Monday arrived cold and clear. The sky that particular shade of deep blue that Montana produced in winter when the cold was absolute, and the air had no humidity in it at all. 2 days to the deadline. Eliza was in the kitchen before light, and she heard the horse on the road before she saw anything, and she went to the window and looked out. It was not one horse. It was several. She counted 4 wagons and at least 6 riders coming up the road toward the ranch house, and in the gray pre-dawn light she could not immediately make out who they were. She felt for one terrible moment the certainty that it was Whitlock, that he'd come early, that he was done waiting. Then she heard Nathaniel on the stairs behind her, and he came to the window and looked, and she heard him make a sound she hadn't heard from him, before a short, rough exhale that was not quite a laugh. That's Olmsted's wagon, he said, and Harker, and he squinted. Evelyn Marlowe's team in the back. They were on the porch when the wagons pulled up. George and Clem had come out of the bunkhouse at the sound of the horses. Rose was at the upstairs window in her nightgown, looking down. June Olmsted climbed down from the first wagon before it had fully stopped, which was a thing she apparently did habitually because her husband Ralph didn't look surprised. She was a short, energetic woman in her 40s who had ordered 2 sets of work shirts from Eliza the week before and had been one of the first people Nathaniel had contacted when this all began. She came toward the porch with the directness of someone who had decided something and was implementing it. "We had a meeting," she said by way of preamble. Nathaniel said a meeting. "Last Thursday, at Harker's place." Adelaide Brennan came. Dorothea Wells from the hotel. Evelyn Marlowe. Some others. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at them. "We've been talking about Whitlock for 3 years. Watching what he does. Watching him pick off families one at a time. And every time, all of us standing by saying it's a shame." She said that last word with a particular flatness that made clear what she thought of standing by saying it's a shame. "We decided we're done watching." Eliza looked past her at the wagons. People were climbing down, men and women both, people she recognized from the county and some she didn't. She saw Adelaide Brennan with her husband. She saw Harker, the sheepman, in a heavy coat. She saw Victor Sabo, which surprised her. The tailor had driven out from town. She saw Dorothea Wells sitting in a wagon seat with her arms folded, watching the scene with her efficient eyes. At the back, driving her own team with the confidence she always had, was Evelyn Marlowe. June Olmsted said, "We took up a collection." She reached into her coat and brought out an envelope and held it out to Nathaniel. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it. Then he looked at June Olmsted, and then at the crowd behind her, and then at Eliza. And Eliza saw something happen in his face that she had not seen before. The careful, controlled composure that he wore like a second coat, showing a crack in it, and behind the crack, something raw. Took the envelope. June said, "It's not charity." "We decided it's not charity. It's what neighbors do when someone's being robbed through legal process, and we have the means to stop it. It's investment in keeping this county from belonging to Caleb Whitlock, piece by piece." She paused. "Also, your wife makes the best quilts any of us has ever seen, and we'd like to keep commissioning her, so you staying is partly selfish." Eliza heard herself make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and was too surprised to be embarrassed by it. Nathaniel opened the envelope. He looked at what was inside. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw was working. He said very quietly, This is too much, I can't." The open count was $240, June said. That's what came in. Nobody was obligated, and nobody was pressured, and every person there gave what they thought was right. She said it with the finality of someone who had already won this argument with several people and wasn't going to fight it again. "It's done. Don't make it complicated." Evelyn Marlowe had climbed down from her wagon and was walking toward the porch now. When she reached the steps, she looked at Eliza with that direct, steady gaze and said, "I told you weren't alone." Eliza said, "You did. Did you believe me?" She thought about the honest answer. "I was trying to." Evelyn Marlowe almost smiled. It was a small thing, but it was real. She said, "That's enough." Nathaniel still had the envelope in his hand. Looked at Eliza. She could see him calculating, adding it to what they had in the tin box, running the number, and she saw the moment he arrived at the sum because something in his face changed. She already knew what the sum was because she'd been doing it in her head since June Olmsted said $240. $862. Enough. More than enough. With room to breathe, he said, "Come inside, all of you. Coffee, and I'll make more." Kitchen was not built for 17 people, and they overflowed into the front room and the hallway, and George and Clem dragged the chairs from the bunkhouse and nobody minded. Rose came downstairs dressed now and moved through the crowd with a directness that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. She knew most of these people, at least by sight, and she accepted being talked to and having her hair commented on and being handed a cup of something warm by Adelaide Brennan, with the composure of a child who had been finding her way back to the world and had gotten considerably further than anyone had expected. Eliza made coffee, and then more coffee, and Nathaniel stood in the front room talking with Olmsted and Harker and some of the other men about the plan for the deadline 2 days out. They would ride into town together, pay off the debt at the attorney's office where Whitlock's note was held, get the receipt stamped and witnessed, and Whitlock would have nothing left to collect on. She stood at the stove, listening to the voices fill the house, and she thought about the letter she'd written at a kitchen table in Georgia, with a candle burning low and the cold pressing at that window too, and words she'd put on that page, "I am not delicate." She'd meant it then. She'd meant it as a kind of defiance, a declaration about what she could endure. She understood it differently now. Not delicate didn't mean you didn't feel things. It didn't mean you weren't scared. It meant you kept going through the feeling, kept your hands working, and your mind clear and your feet on the ground, even when the ground was not exactly stable. No, it meant you let people help you when they offered, and you held on to what was yours, and you didn't mistake stubbornness for strength or pride for dignity. She looked across the crowded kitchen at Rose, who was sitting next to Evelyn Marlowe at the table, and apparently being told something that involved Evelyn gesturing with both hands, and Rose was listening with complete attention and a small, private smile that was the most unguarded thing Eliza had seen on the girl's face. She looked at Nathaniel, who was in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, and had been watching her, she realized, for a moment or two before she noticed. When she met his eyes, he didn't look away. He said nothing. Didn't need to. She turned back to the stove. She poured another cup of coffee and handed it to whoever was next in line. 2 days left. They were going to be okay. But 2 days was still 2 days, and she had been learning since she was 11 years old, that you did not celebrate before the thing was done. Kept going. You picked up the needle, and you kept going until the seam was finished, and the knot was tied, and there was nothing left to give out. So she poured the coffee, and she kept going. Tuesday morning, the day before the deadline, Whitlock came back. She was in the barn, checking on the ewe Rose had been concerned about. The animal had been off her feed and was moving oddly, and George thought she might be early with a lamb when she heard the horse on the road. She looked out through the barn door and watched Whitlock ride up alone again. Same black horse, same expensive coat, and she stood very still for a moment with her hand on the barn door. He went to the front porch. He knocked. She could see it from where she stood. Nathaniel answered. She couldn't hear the conversation from the barn, just the shape of it. 2 voices, Nathaniel's lower and zestier, and Whitlock's with the particular measured quality of a man who was used to controlling conversations. Went on for several minutes. Then Whitlock's hand came up and there was a gesture, not threatening, just deliberate, and then he turned and walked back to his horse. Paused at the horse. He turned and looked toward the barn. Looked directly at where Eliza was standing in the doorway, too far for expression to register, but close enough that she knew the look was intentional. He'd known she was there. He held it for a moment. Then he mounted and rode away. She walked to the house. Nathaniel was still on the porch. She said, "What did he want?" Nathaniel said, "He made another offer. North Acreage again. Different terms this time. He'd forgive the debt entirely and give us $200 besides if we signed over the creek section in the North 40. He's worried, she said. He's heard something, Nathaniel agreed. He was looking down the road where the dust of Whitlock's horse was settling. Someone told him about the collection. He doesn't know the number, but he knows something changed. He's trying to get what he can before tomorrow. That's what I think. Stood on the porch beside him in the cold, and they both looked at the empty road. She said, "You told him no." I told him no. Good. Turned and looked at her. "You know what occurs to me," he said. "What?" "That man rode out here twice now, once with riders to make himself look powerful. Once alone, which means he's starting to feel less powerful. He said it with a quietness that was not satisfaction exactly. It was too controlled for satisfaction, but was something close to it. He's used to people folding. "We're not folding," she said. "No," he said, "we're not." They went inside. Rose was at the table with her lessons. Tin box was on the shelf, with the envelope from June Olmsted's collection added to it, $862 that had been earned and given, and fought for over 3 of the hardest weeks she'd ever worked. Tomorrow they would ride into town and end this. Tonight she had one more quilt panel to finish. Because the work did not stop, just because the crisis had a resolution in sight, gone because Dorothea Wells was waiting on her linens, gone because Victor Sabo had mentioned quietly, got the end of his visit on Monday, that he had 4 more riding habit commissions coming in the spring and had asked whether she'd be interested in a standing arrangement. She sat down at the kitchen table. She picked up her needle. The lamp was burning, and the stove was warm, and Rose was writing something in her lessons notebook with the tip of her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and outside the mountains were darkening toward evening. Particular deep blue of a Montana winter sky going tonight. She pulled the thread through the fabric and set the stitch and pulled it again. And the seam grew, and the panel came together under her hands. And she did not stop. They rode into town on the deadline morning with the money in a leather satchel that Nathaniel kept inside his coat, pressed against his chest like something he was protecting from weather. Which he was, in a way. Not from weather, but from the particular cold that came off men like Whitlock, the kind that didn't need wind to carry it. Eliza rode beside him. Rose was behind them in the wagon with George driving, because she had asked to come and neither of them had been able to think of a good reason to say no. Clem stayed at the ranch to watch the property, which he'd volunteered for without being asked, in the way he did things he'd already decided were necessary. Sky was flat and white, the kind that pressed down close to the mountains and made everything feel smaller and more immediate. Road into town was frozen solid, and the horses' hooves rang out on it in the cold. Nobody talked much on the way in. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, and what lay ahead required a kind of concentration that conversation would interrupt. Eliza had counted the money twice more the night before, and once again this morning, which she knew was excessive and did it anyway. $862. Note was for $840. Plus interest accumulated, Nathaniel had gotten the precise final figure from Whitlock's lawyer's letter, which had arrived the week before, $811.40. All told, which was the principal plus the interest Whitlock had been running. They had $50.60 more than they needed. She had held that $50.60 in her mind like a handhold. Whitlock's lawyer operated out of an office above the dry goods store, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had been in the territory 8 years and had the smooth, careful manner of someone who had learned to be useful to whoever held the money in a given situation. Eliza had never met him, but Nathaniel had twice, and he'd described Pruitt as a man who was doing his job rather than an enemy, which she thought was a useful distinction to maintain today. D. You didn't fight the instrument. You settled the debt and made it so the instrument had nothing left to execute. They tied the horses at the post below the dry goods store. George helped Rose down from the wagon. They went up the stairs. Pruitt's office was a narrow room with a large desk and 2 chairs for clients and a filing cabinet that ran the length of the back wall. He was at his desk when they came in, and he stood a reflex of professional courtesy and looked at the 4 of them with an expression that rearranged itself quickly from mild surprise at the number of them to professional neutrality. "Cross," he said. "I wasn't expecting. We're here to settle the note," Nathaniel said. He opened his coat and took out the satchel and set it on the desk. "Full payment, principal and interest. I'll need a receipt stamped and signed." Pruitt looked at the satchel. He looked at Nathaniel. Something moved in his face that was too brief to read. Said, "Today is the deadline." "I'm aware of that." "Mr. Whitlock. Mr. Whitlock's claim on this debt ends when I pay it," Nathaniel said. He said it without heat, the way he said everything flat and clear and not interested in argument. "That's how a debt works." Pruitt sat back down slowly, pulled the satchel toward him, and opened it and looked at the contents. He began to count. He was methodical about it, which Eliza had expected. A lawyer in this position would be methodical, because his job right now was to be accurate and unimpeachable. And he knew it. She watched his hands move through the bills and coins, and she kept her face arranged in the same neutral expression she'd been wearing since they'd walked up the stairs, and she breathed carefully through her nose. Rose was standing beside her, very still, holding the edge of Eliza's coat sleeve without gripping it, just touching it, the way she did when she wanted contact without making a demand of it. Pruitt counted through the pile twice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is the full amount." "Yes," Nathaniel said. Pruitt opened his desk drawer and took out the official note, the document that represented the debt, and he turned it face up on the desk between them. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man running through his professional obligations. Then he took his stamp and his ink pad from the desk drawer, and he stamped the document once, heavily, with the words "Satisfied." Then he signed it below, dated it. He pressed his notary seal into it. He did all of this with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this paper needed to be completely unassailable. Pushed it across the desk to Nathaniel. Nathaniel picked it up. He read it. He folded it and put it inside his coat, next to where the satchel had been, and he stood there for a moment with his hand flat against his chest over it. Pruitt said, "I'll need to notify Mr. Whitlock that the debt has been satisfied." "Do that," Nathaniel said. They left the office, went it down the stairs and out into the cold street, and George was waiting with the horses in the wagon, and he looked at Nathaniel's face and said, "Done?" "Done," Nathaniel said. George said good, and left it at that because George was a man who understood that some moments didn't need more than that. Rose looked up at Eliza. She said, "Is it over?" Eliza said, "It's over." Rose was quiet for a moment, processing this with the seriousness she brought to significant information. Then she said, "Can we get something to eat? I didn't have breakfast because we left early." Nathaniel made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in weeks. It was short and rough and real. He said, "Yeah, we can get something to eat." Went to the cafe on the main street, which was warm and smelled of bacon and bread and had 6 tables. 4 of them occupied by local men who looked up when they came in and nodded at Nathaniel with the comfortable familiarity of people who knew each other in the way of a small community. Eliza had not been in this cafe before, and she looked around it with the mild curiosity she brought to new rooms, a skill she'd developed from a lifetime of finding herself in situations she hadn't chosen and needing to understand them quickly. The woman who ran it came over and took their order and brought coffee, and Rose got a plate of eggs and a piece of bread with jam. And she ate with the concentrated focus of a genuinely hungry child. Then Eliza sat across from Nathaniel and drank her coffee and let the last 3 weeks settle down into something she could look at from a little distance. Nathaniel was looking at the table. He'd been quiet since they left Pruett's office, not the troubled quiet of before, not the one that meant he was working through something hard. This was different. This was the quiet of a man who had been braced for something for a very long time and had just been told to stop bracing. She said, "You should eat something." He picked up his coffee. "I'm fine. You're sitting there like you're waiting for something else to go wrong." Looked up. "Habit," he said. And then after a moment, "It's a hard habit to break." "I know." She set her cup down, "but you can work on it." "Ah." He looked at her across the table with an expression she'd been slowly learning to read, the one that appeared when he was thinking something he wasn't sure how to put into words and was deciding whether to try. He said when Pruitt stamped that paper, he stopped. "I've been carrying that debt for 3 years. Not just the money. The weight of it. Knowing it was out there. Knowing what would happen if I couldn't." He stopped again. Looked at the table. "Clara didn't know about it. I borrowed the money 6 months before she died to get through a bad winter, and I was going to pay it back before it became a problem. And then she died and everything. Everything went sideways for a while." He said it plainly, without self-pity, just describing what had happened. "By the time I came back up for air, Whitlock had the note." Eliza listened. She had known most of this, had pieced it together from various conversations and the account book and the things he'd said and hadn't said. But she let him tell it, because the telling was different from the piecing together. He said, "I wrote that advertisement because I was drowning, and I needed someone who could help me hold things together." Sounds like he paused. It wasn't the most honorable reason to send for a wife. It was honest, she said. It was selfish, Nathaniel. She waited until he looked at her. "Told me the truth in that letter. You told me about Rose. You told me the work was hard and the winter was hard. You didn't promise me anything you couldn't deliver. That's more than most people manage." She picked up her coffee. "I answered that advertisement because I was also drowning. We were honest with each other from the beginning. That's the only reason any of this worked." He was quiet. Rose was watching them both with the peripheral awareness she had. She appeared to be completely focused on her bread and jam, but she was tracking everything, as she always did. Nathaniel said, "I don't know how to..." He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not good at this, at saying things directly." "I've noticed that," she said. "I'm working on it." "I know you are," he said. "Thank you for what you did. What you built these last 3 weeks." He said it quietly, directly, looking at her. Not with the sideways quality of someone delivering a compliment they're embarrassed by, but with the front-facing honesty of a man saying the true thing because it needed saying. "Couldn't have Rose, and I would have lost everything. I want you to know I understand that." She held his gaze. "We did it," she said. "Not just me, Eliza. The collection. Evelyn Marlowe showing up. George staying on without pay when we couldn't cover his wages. Rose sewing buttons at the kitchen table every evening." She shook her head. "That was one part of it. You were the part that held it together," he said. She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she disagreed, and she wasn't sure it mattered who had been what part. She knew was that they were all still here, and the paper in Nathaniel's coat pocket said "Satisfied," and Rose was eating eggs with jam, and they were going to go home to the ranch today, and it was going to still be theirs when they got there. That was enough. That was more than enough. They were on their way out of the cafe when Percy Dunbar appeared in the doorway with his coat half on and an expression of someone who had been looking for them. He said, "Thought I'd catch you before you headed back." "Quilt sold," Eliza said. "Already?" "Woman came in this morning, wife of the new land surveyor. They just arrived from Billings. She saw it in the window and asked the price and bought it without negotiating." He reached into his coat and brought out the $18, counted it out. Also asked whether there were more. "I told her I expected so." He looked at Eliza with the expression he'd had when they'd made their arrangement, the merchant's look, assessing and not unfriendly. "I've had 3 more people ask about them since Monday. If you can supply, I can sell." She took the $18. She said, "How many do you think you can move in a month? Price? 2, maybe 3 if the quality holds." Quality holds. Then 2 or 3 a month, he paused. Writing habit woman Victor Sabo's customer, she was in the store yesterday. She wants to know if you make women's everyday dresses. Not work clothes. Something better. I make everything, Eliza said. Percy Dunbar nodded. I'll send them to you. He shook her hand the same way Evelyn Marlowe had, businesslike and direct, and went back into the store. Daniel was watching from a few feet away. He said, 2 or 3 quilts a month. $18 each, she said. Maybe more as the market develops. Did the arithmetic. She could see him doing it. That's a regular income, separate from the cattle. That's what I've been thinking about, she said. He looked at her. Then he said, carefully, like he was feeling the edges of a new idea. Ranch isn't just a cattle operation anymore. Not if we don't want it to be, she said. They stood in the street in the cold, in the middle of the small town that was their nearest connection to the wider world. Between them, something settled into place, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just the quiet click of 2 people arriving at the same understanding at the same moment. George had the wagon ready. Rose was already in it, having climbed up herself with the matter-of-fact competence she'd been developing for the last several weeks, and she was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the mountains to the north, with the expression of someone for whom the mountains had personal meaning. They rode home. 3 days after they paid the debt, a letter arrived. George brought it in from the road where the weekly post rider had left it. Gaw and Eliza was at the kitchen table still sewing. Always sewing, though the desperate quality of it had lifted, and what remained was just the work itself, which she found she didn't mind, and she looked at the handwriting on the envelope and didn't recognize it. She opened it. It was from Gerald Pruett. It was brief, 3 paragraphs, written in the precise lawyerly script she'd have expected from him. He was writing, he said, not in his capacity as Whitlock's legal representative, as that relationship had concluded with the satisfaction of the debt. He was writing personally. He said that he had worked for Caleb Whitlock for 4 years and had watched him acquire 14 properties in that time through the method he had attempted with the Cross Ranch, and that in no previous case had any of the families found a way to meet the deadline. He said he had notified his employer that morning that he would not be renewing their arrangement. Said he thought she should know that, and he wished her family well. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she put it down on the table and looked at it. Rose came in from outside. She'd been with the ewe, who had finally produced a lamb 2 days before, a week early and undersized, but apparently determined, which Rose had taken as a personal matter and was monitoring with the intensity she brought to things she'd decided were her responsibility. She looked at Eliza's face and said, "What's that?" "The letter from a lawyer." Rose sat down and looked at the letter from across the table with the directness she had. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news," Eliza said, "I think." "Mostly." Rose nodded. She accepted that. She said, "The lamb ate this morning." "On her own?" "Did she? She's still small. But George says she's going to be fine." Eliza looked at her, this child who had folded herself up and was now slowly unfolding, who had come downstairs in the dark to watch a woman she didn't know mend her mother's quilt, and had said one word into a quiet kitchen and started finding her way back, who sewed buttons with careful, even stitches and kept lists of what they had, and had made a lamb her personal concern. "Good," Eliza said. "Let's keep an eye on her." "I already am," Rose said, with the mild certainty of someone stating the obvious, and went back outside, picked up her needle. She thought about Pruitt's letter and what it said about the 14 families before them, and she felt something that was not quite grief. She hadn't known those families, had no way to grieve them specifically, but was related to it. 14 operations, 14 sets of people who had built something with their hands and had it taken through the machinery of legal process. She thought about whether what they'd done here could have helped any of those families. And the answer was probably not directly, because what they'd done depended on specific circumstances, on neighbors who chose to show up, on a woman with 30 years of savings and a sense of obligation to her own past, on skills and stubbornness and a 7-year-old's button sewing and a timber job that had paid $31 instead of $50, and the adjustments that failure had forced. Thought about Whitlock. She thought about him riding away from this ranch twice and going to Pruitt's office to be told the debt was settled, and now losing his lawyer. She did not feel triumphant about it. Triumph required a kind of expansiveness she didn't have the energy for right now. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. She felt that the ground under her feet was hers. Nathaniel told her about the ring on a Saturday evening, 2 weeks after the deadline. Came in from the barn, he'd been out late, checking on the early lamb himself, because Rose's concern was apparently communicable, and he sat down at the kitchen table across from her while she was finishing the last panel of Adelaide Brennan's second quilt commission, and he set something on the table between them. It was a ring. Not his mother's band, she was wearing that already. This one was different, a slender gold band, with a small turquoise stone set into it, the stone a particular shade of blue-green that she looked at and thought of the fabric she'd used to repair Clara's quilt. Color of something salvaged and made whole. She looked at it. She didn't touch it yet. He said, I had it made in town. There's a jeweler 2 streets over, from the dry goods store. I didn't know he was there until Victor Sabo mentioned him. He said this with the slightly compressed quality of someone who has rehearsed something and is now getting through it. I had him set the stone last week. I picked it up today. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. He said, you came here on a contract. That was the honest truth of it. We both knew what it was. And I've thought a lot about whether it was fair to you. Bring someone out here on those terms. He paused. But I've also thought about what I actually know now. About who you are. And I want you to have something that isn't... He stopped. Started again. My mother's ring was what I had. It was practical. This is what I want. For you to have something I chose because of you specifically. Pick the ring up. She turned it over in her fingers. Turquoise caught the lamplight. It was not a large stone or an expensive ring. She knew enough about such things to know that, but the choosing of it was in it, visibly, the way choosing was sometimes visible in things. She said, you picked the color. I thought about the quilt, he said. Color you found in Clara's basket. The color you used. He said it straightforwardly, without the hesitation that might have made it sentimental. I thought it was the right color for something that belonged to you. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Georgia and the candle burning low, and the 12 sentences she'd written to a stranger, and what she'd expected, which was survival, which was escape, which was the chance to prove capable in a place where it might count for something. She thought about what she'd found instead. This particular man, with his heavy handwriting and his consistent honesty, and the way he let silences be what they were. A child who was unfolding by inches, saw neighbors who showed up with wagons on a cold Monday morning, and an old woman who'd shaken her hand at the door and said, I told you you weren't alone. She slid the ring onto her right hand because her left already had the silver band. She looked at it there. He said, I know we said the words already. I know it's done already. Legally, he had his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at her directly, which she'd come to understand was just how he was when he was saying something that mattered. But I wanted to ask you, not because of a contract or a circumstance, just to ask you. She looked at him. She said, are you asking me to marry you? Nathaniel Cross, after we've already been married for 2 months? Yes, he said, without any apparent embarrassment about this. I am. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She said, yes. He exhaled briefly, quietly, the release of someone who had been more uncertain than they'd let on. She noticed it. She stored it. Later she would think. That was the moment she understood something about him that she hadn't quite seen before. That under the steadiness was a person who was not always certain, who needed things even when he didn't say so, who was brave enough to ask for them in his own language, even when that language was halting. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not the ring hand, but the other one, the one with the needle calluses, and left it there for a moment. He didn't squeeze or perform it. He just put his hand over hers and left it. She turned her hand and held his. Outside, the wind came off the mountain in the particular way it had in late winter, when the season was starting to think about shifting but hadn't committed yet, still cold, but with something different underneath it, some edge of change that you couldn't name exactly but recognized. In the days that followed, the ranch reorganized itself around a new equilibrium that wasn't dramatically different from before, but felt fundamentally changed in the way that things feel changed when the thing you were afraid of doesn't happen. Cattle were there, 3 fewer steers, but the breeding stock intact, next season's income still present. North acreage along the creek was still theirs. Fence line Whitlock's rider had ridden was just a fence line again, boundary of their own property rather than a watched perimeter. George and Clem received their back wages, which Nathaniel paid in full on the Monday after the deadline without the men having asked, and the look on George's face when he took the money was the uncomplicated relief of someone who had needed it and was glad not to have to ask for it. Eliza noted that Nathaniel had prioritized that payment over several other things he could have done with the money. She thought, yes, this is the kind of man he is. This is who I married. The sewing work continued, not at the desperate pace of those 3 weeks, but steadily, with purpose. Dorothea Wells received her first batch of hotel linens and sent back a note that said exactly right in 4 words, which Eliza thought was probably the warmest thing the woman wrote to anyone. Victor Sabo's writing habit customers became regular customers. One of them brought her sister, who brought a friend. And by the end of the month, there was a steady stream of women from town and the surrounding county coming to the ranch on sewing days. Eliza had designated 3 days a week for fittings and orders, and the kitchen table that had been the site of sew. Many late-night calculations was now also a place where women sat and were measured and talked and decided what they wanted. Rose participated in this with a naturalness that continued to surprise Eliza, who had expected the social activity to overwhelm a child who'd been so recently silent. Rut moved through the sewing days with the quiet competence she'd been developing, handing pins when they were needed, holding fabric when asked, answering questions put to her by customers with the direct, undecorated responses she gave to everyone. Several of the women commented to Eliza some within Rose's earshot, which Eliza thought was probably intentional, that the girl was remarkable. Rose heard this and did not appear to need it, which Eliza thought was the right response to being told you were remarkable. Adelaide Brennan came for her second quilt fitting on a Thursday, and she stayed afterward for coffee in the way she'd fallen into doing. Because Adelaide was a woman who enjoyed being at the center of things and had adopted the Cross Ranch sewing days as a social occasion. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "Have you thought about teaching?" Eliza said, "Teaching what?" "Sewing. What do you think?" Adelaide gestured around the kitchen with the hand that wasn't holding her cup. "You have women coming out here 3 days a week already. Half of them are as interested in learning as they are in ordering. June Olmsted told me she's never been able to finish a proper seam in her life and she'd pay for lessons." Eliza considered this. She'd noticed the interest, the questions that went beyond, just "can you make this?" and into, "how would you make this?" The way some of the women watched her hands when she demonstrated something. She'd answered those questions when they came up, without thinking of it as teaching. "Classes," she said. "Why not?" Adelaide said, "1 morning a week. Charge per session. You already have the students." She sipped her coffee. "You have a skills that's rare in this county. That's worth something beyond just the finished product." Eliza thought about Percy Dunbar and I Can Supply. You can sell, and the way one thing led to another when you let it. She said, "I'd need another work table." "Nathaniel can build a table," Adelaide said, with the brisk certainty of someone who had never doubted that practical problems had practical solutions. Nathaniel, when asked that evening, said, "How big?" Which was how the kitchen acquired a second work table, built over a weekend from lumber Nathaniel sourced from the yard and assembled with the same competent thoroughness he brought to every physical task, and how the Cross Ranch began, quietly and without planning it exactly, to be a place where women came not just to commission work, but to learn something. It was not what Eliza had imagined when she'd answered a 12-line advertisement in a Georgia kitchen. She had not imagined much. She'd been careful not to build pictures that would disappoint her. If she'd been asked in that Georgia kitchen to describe the best possible version of what she was going toward, she would not have imagined this. She would not have had the vocabulary for it. She hadn't known yet that you could build something from a contract and stubbornness and 3 weeks of exhaustion and the generosity of strangers who became neighbors, who became something more than that. She hadn't known that was a thing that happened. She knew it now. Whitlock left the county in April. News came through Percy Dunbar's store, where it came through all news of that kind, delivered in the matter-of-fact way. Percy delivered information that was interesting, but not personal to him. Sold his interest in the lending firm to a company in Denver, Percy said. Talk that he'd had some legal trouble in another county. A challenge to one of his property acquisitions from a family that had found a lawyer willing to argue the debt had been fraudulently inflated. Nothing proven, but enough to make the territory less comfortable. Eliza heard this on a Tuesday when she was in the store picking up thread, and she stood at the counter and held the information for a moment. She said, "What happened to the families he bought out? Is any of that reversible?" Percy looked at her. He said, "I don't know. Probably not most of it. It was all done legally." "Legally," she said. "Technically," he said, and she heard the distinction he was drawing. She thought about Pruitt's letter, the 14 families, and what technically legal looked like when it wore the right clothes. D. She thought about what she could do with that. The honest answer was, not much, not directly, not for those specific families. What she could do was be here, be on this land, be a person who showed other people that it was possible to hold on. She bought her thread and went home. That evening, after supper, Rose asked Nathaniel to read to her, which she did most evenings, had done for months now, ritual of it as established as any other part of their days. Tonight, she didn't bring him a book. She brought him a piece of paper with writing on it in her careful, still developing hand. Nathaniel looked at it. He said, "What's this?" "I wrote a story," Rose said. "Will you read it?" He looked at the paper. Eliza was at the table with her sewing, and she kept her eyes on it, giving them the privacy of not watching directly while still being close enough to hear. Nathaniel read it. It was not a long story. Rose was 7, and the story was short, about a lamb that was born small and learned to eat on her own and grew strong enough to surprise everyone who doubted her. It was not subtle in its parallels, but it was not trying to be. It was a child writing about what she knew, which was the only way anyone learned to write anything. When he finished reading, Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is good, Rose. Is it true?" Rose said. "Can a lamb really do that?" "Already happened," he said. "Right out in the south pasture." "I know," Rose said. "I watched it happen. That's why I wrote it." She took the paper back and looked at it with the particular expression of someone assessing their own work. Eliza said, "Writing things down is how you figure out what you know." Nathaniel looked across the room at Eliza. She kept her eyes on the seam she was setting. She could feel him looking. He said to Rose, "She's right." Rose said, "I thought so." And she folded the paper and put it in her pocket, like something she was keeping, and she went to get her nightgown from upstairs, because it was getting to be that time of evening. Nathaniel crossed the kitchen to where Eliza was sitting. Didn't say anything. He just stood beside the table for a moment, and she looked up at him. He looked back. Between them was everything that had happened since February. The wedding and the debt, and the 3 weeks of work, and the morning at Pruitt's office, and the ring made in the color of a salvaged quilt. And none of it needed to be said because it was all just there in the room, as real as the walls. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just rested it there for a moment, the way you touched something you were glad was solid, and then he went to bank the stove for the night. Outside, the Montana dark was full of stars. The kind of night you got in late winter when the sky was dry and the air had no weight to it, and everything above the mountains was very bright and very far away. Spring was not far off. The lamb in the south pasture was gaining weight. Second work table was in the kitchen. The hotel linens were done. Quilt at Percy Dunbar's had sold, and there was a buyer asking about the next one. Grissom, and somewhere in his coat, in the inside pocket where he kept important things, Nathaniel Cross had a document stamped satisfied that said, "In the formal language of legal instruments, this debt is discharged. This land is clear. This is yours." Spring came to the Cross Ranch the way it always came to that part of Montana. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments you had to pay attention to notice. Week of mornings where the frost didn't reach quite as deep. A day when the light through the kitchen windows had a different quality, something warmer in the angle of it. Cottonwoods along the road, putting out the first pale suggestion of green against bark that had been gray and bare for months. Eliza noticed all of it. She had learned, in the months since February, to pay attention to this land in a way she hadn't paid attention to any place before. Not because she'd been told to, but because the land gave back to you in proportion to how carefully you watched it, when she had come to understand that watching was its own form of belonging. Was out by the south fence on a morning in early April, checking the section that had given them trouble all winter, when Rose appeared from the direction of the barn at a pace slightly faster than her usual walk. She was carrying something. But when she got close enough, Eliza saw it was the lamb small enough still to be carried. Though she was getting heavy for it held against Rose's chest with both arms, the animal enduring this with the resigned tolerance she had developed for Rose's affections. She got out again, Rose said. "I can see that. The gap in the far corner. George said he fixed it." "George fixed the top half," Eliza said. "Bottom half needs another board." She looked at the lamb, who was regarding her with the mild, stupid expression of an animal that had no understanding of how much trouble she caused. "Put her back and tell George about the board." "I already told him." "Getting it." Rose shifted the lamb's weight. "She's getting fat." "She is," Eliza agreed. "Fat and ungrateful." Rose looked at the lamb with an expression of complete, uncomplicated affection. "She's not ungrateful. She just doesn't know how to show it." Eliza looked at her stepdaughter. This child she had not expected, who had arrived in her life as a complication and become something she did not have a sufficient word for, and thought that is possibly the most Rose thing Rose has ever said. She said, "Take her back, and put on your coat properly. You've got one button done." Rose looked down at herself. She had indeed fastened only the single middle button of her coat, which was her consistent failure at dressing herself, a habit Eliza had been correcting for months without visible progress. Stopping it, she looked back up with the expression of someone who had just been reminded of something they'd known and set aside. She did the remaining buttons one-handed, the lamb still pressed to her chest, and went back toward the barn. Eliza turned back to the fence. She pressed the loose board with her palm, feeling where it had given. She thought, George's next task. She thought, we need more boards from the lumber yard. She thought, briefly and without urgency, about the ordering she'd need to do in town this week. Thread. More muslin backing for the quilts. Particular buttons Adelaide Brennan had requested for the dress commission that was going to take up most of her Tuesdays for the next 3 weeks. Thinking was different than it had been in February. Every thought had the quality of emergency everything filtered through the deadline. Everything weighted against that number. Now the thoughts were just plans, the ordinary business of a life being lived forward rather than defended. She had not understood, until she no longer had to do it, how much energy it took to be perpetually braced. Nathaniel found her at the fence 20 minutes later. He'd been out to the north pasture to check on the cattle and was coming back on foot, which he did when he wanted to think. She'd learned that about him. That walking was how he processed things, the same way she processed things with her hands in motion. Came and stood beside her and looked at the fence. She said, "George, get the board?" "He's getting it." "Good." He put his hand on the post and tested it. "Post held," he said. "I heard from Olmsted this morning. He's putting together a request to the county commissioner about the road on the east side, wants it properly graded before next winter. He asked if we'd sign on. Sign on how? Put our name to the petition. Contribute a day's labor in the summer when they do the work." She said, "Yes, of course." He nodded. He had known she'd say yes. She could tell by the way he'd asked, without preamble, because he wasn't asking whether but just telling her what was happening. That was new. Not new like a change he'd made deliberately, but new like something that had happened gradually without either of them noting the exact moment, the way he talked to her about the ranch, as if her answer was already part of his calculation. As if she was already in it, which she was, which she had been for months now. She said, "The lamb got out again. Bottom board on the far south corner. I'll fix it tonight. George is doing the board. Post needs resetting too, though. Tonight," he said, with the mild stubbornness of a man who had his own ordering of tasks. She didn't argue it. She had learned that some things with Nathaniel were better left to settle themselves, and the post in question was one of them. Walked back to the house together in the morning quiet, and it was ordinary, the ordinarist thing. Two people walking across their own land in early spring, and she felt it as something close to astonishment. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that came from looking at where you were and understanding how far it was from where you'd started. Evelyn Marlowe came in late April, and this time she did not knock with that authoritative fist. She came in the way she'd taken to coming in the last couple of months, pulling her wagon up to the post, tying the horse, and walking to the door with the ease of someone who had decided they were welcome and acted accordingly, which was the only way Evelyn did anything. Eliza had coffee on when she came in, because Evelyn's visits had fallen into enough of a pattern that she'd started expecting them. She sat at the kitchen table, the main one, not the work table, which had 2 unfinished quilt panels laid out on it, and Evelyn did what she did at the beginning of every visit, which was look around the kitchen and note the changes since her last time. The second work table she'd approved of with a single nod when it appeared. The basket system Eliza had developed for organizing orders by deadline she'd examined with the interest of a person who appreciated systems. Today she looked at the quilt panels, and then at the window, where Eliza had put up new curtains last week, in a pale yellow that changed the light in the room considerably. Evelyn said, "Those are good." "Rose picked the color," Eliza said. Evelyn nodded, which was Evelyn's version of being pleased. She picked up her coffee. She said, "I had a letter from my daughter in Billings. She's asking me to come stay for the summer. Are you going?" "I haven't decided." She said it with the flatness of someone for whom the decision was genuinely open, which was not how Evelyn usually carried things. She usually had decided. Eliza looked at her. "What's the hesitation?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands. A habit she had, this slow turning when she was sorting through something. She said, I've spent 30 years making that operation what it is. My husband started it. I finished it. Everything on that land is something I put there. She paused. Going to Billings for a summer feels like, she stopped. Like letting go of something, Eliza said. Like admitting I might not need to hold it so tight anymore. Evelyn looked at the window, which is not the same thing, but it feels the same. Eliza thought about February. She thought about the posture of someone perpetually braced. She said, You've earned a summer in Billings. I know that. The operation will be there when you get back. I know that too. Evelyn looked at her. It's not really about the operation. Eliza held her gaze. She said, Then what is it about? Evelyn was quiet long enough that the sound from outside Rose talking to the lamb in the yard, the familiar one-sided conversation she carried on with the animal, came clearly through the window. Then she said, When my husband died, I told myself the ranch was enough. I had built something, and that was sufficient, and I didn't need anything else. She said it plainly, without self-pity. I believed that for a long time. It was even true, mostly. She paused. But watching what you've built here, she stopped again. Eliza waited. You didn't come here with a plan, Evelyn said. Came here with 12 sentences in a letter, and your hands, and whatever you had that passes for courage. You built, she gestured at the kitchen, got the curtains, the panels on the work table, the sound of Rose's voice outside. You built this, which is what I did 30 years ago. Except I stopped at the ranch. She looked at her coffee. I think going to my daughter's for the summer is the next thing. I've just been too stubborn to say so, Eliza said. That sounds right. Evelyn said, Don't be smug about it. I'm not being smug. You're sitting there looking like you knew that already. I had a guess, Eliza said. Evelyn made a sound that on anyone else would have been a laugh. She picked up her coffee and drank and set it down. She said, How's the girl? Rose Eliza considered. She wrote another story last week, about the lamb again, but with more plot this time. She read it to me and then asked me to tell her what was wrong with it. What was wrong with it? Nothing that 7-year-old writing usually gets wrong. But I told her, and she went and fixed it and brought it back. Eliza shook her head slightly. She's not interested in being told she did well. She wants to know how to do better. Evelyn said, She's her father's daughter. She's her own person, Eliza said. Though yes, some of it's her father. Evelyn smiled, a real one this time, the kind she didn't produce often, and that meant more for the rarity of it. Stayed another hour. When she left, she shook Eliza's hand at the door the same way she always did, and then something she had not done before. She put her other hand briefly over Eliza's as well. 2 hands. The difference between a handshake and something more than a handshake. She went to her wagon and drove back down the road without looking back, which was also how she always did it. Eliza stood at the door and watched her go and thought about 30 years of building something alone, and 1 summer in Billings, and what it took to admit you were allowed to want the next thing. She thought about how courage was not one thing. It was not just the big moments, the kitchen table conversations about debt, the rides into town with satchels of money, the closed doors held firm against men with cold eyes. It was also the smaller admissions. The willingness to say, I have held this tightly enough, and now I will hold it differently. She went back inside. The sewing lessons began on the first Friday in May, which had been Adelaide Brennan's suggestion and turned out to be correct. Fridays worked for the women who came, who were mostly ranching wives for whom the middle of the week was too full and the weekend too involved with family. 7 women showed up for the first lesson, which was more than Eliza had expected and required her to reorganize the kitchen considerably. She moved the work table to one side and brought in the 2 chairs from the front room, and George and Clem carried the bunkhouse bench up to the porch and in through the back door, grumbling about the weight with the companionable grumbling of men who didn't actually mind. She had not taught before, and she had not known how she would be at it. She discovered in those first 2 hours that she was adequate, and then better than adequate, and that the thing that made her better was the same thing that had made the sewing itself work. She did not pretend the difficulty wasn't real. When June Olmsted's first seam puckered because she'd pulled the thread too tight, Eliza did not say, good try, or that's almost right. She said, your tension's off. Feel how tight your grip is. Gee, loosen it. June loosened it and ran the seam again, and it lay flat. And the expression on June Olmsted's face, a woman in her 40s who had apparently convinced herself she was hopeless at this, was not triumphant but was something better, surprised. Genuinely surprised that she had done it. Rose moved through the lesson with the ease of a child for whom this had become her ordinary world, handing pins, retrieving dropped things, answering questions put to her by the women with the calm directness she was known for. At one point, Adelaide Brennan asked her, somewhat rhetorically, whether she liked having all these women in her kitchen, and Rose said, "It's not only a kitchen anymore," which made Adelaide laugh out loud and earned Rose an approving look from June Olmsted and a moment of quiet from Eliza, who heard it as something true in a way Rose might not have entirely intended. It was not only a kitchen anymore. On a Saturday evening in late May, Nathaniel asked her to walk with him. This was not unusual. They walked in the evenings sometimes, when the work had settled for the day, and the light was long, and the land was at its most worth looking at. But tonight he had something in the way he asked that made her pay attention, and she said yes, and they went out through the back door and toward the north pasture, which was where the land opened up, and you could see the mountains properly. Walked for a while without talking. The grass was coming in green and certain, the kind of green that meant the worst was over, and the land knew it. Creek was running high from snowmelt, audible before visible. And, when they reached the north fence line, they stood and looked at it in the evening light, the water moving fast over the stones. Nathaniel said, "I want to show you something." He took her farther along the fence, to the corner of the north section, where the creek made a bend. She'd been here before, had walked this whole property line over the winter, but she'd never stood here with him specifically, and she looked at where he was looking. It was a flat area above the creek bend, sheltered on two sides by a natural fold in the hillside. It was a particular piece of ground, though she hadn't registered it consciously, before protected from the worst of the north wind, with good drainage and a southeastern exposure that would get light from morning onward. She said, "What am I looking at?" Clara always thought this was the best spot on the property, he said. He wasn't looking at her, was looking at the ground, the way he did when he was saying something that cost him. She wanted to build a proper garden up here. Not a kitchen garden, she had that. Something bigger, flowers, she said. Not practical ones. Just stopped, she never got to do it. Eliza was quiet. "I've been thinking," he said, "that it should be done. Not for Clara, she's gone, and the garden would be for the living, not her. Because she was right. It's a good spot." He turned and looked at her. "I thought you might want it. To make it what you wanted, not what she was imagining. Your own thing." She looked at the flat ground with its southeastern exposure, and the creek running below it, and the mountain rising beyond. She thought about Georgia, the small yard behind her mother's house that she'd grown up wanting to do something with and never had the chance. She thought about what it meant to be given a piece of ground and told, "Make this yours." She said, "You'd help me break the ground?" "This summer," he said. "When it's ready." She looked at the spot for a long moment. She thought about what she'd plant, the useful things. Yes, but also the other things. Things that had no purpose except to be looked at. Beauty was not a luxury, and she had learned that early and forgotten it for a while, and was remembering it now. She thought about Rose, who would want to be involved, who would have opinions about the flowers, and would probably try to bring the lamb up here, and would need to be redirected on that point. She said, "Yes." He nodded. They stood there a while longer, looking at the ground that was going to become a garden. Creek ran below them, and the mountains were going purple in the evening light, and somewhere behind them toward the house. They could hear Rose calling for the lamb in the tone she used when the animal had gone somewhere inconvenient again. Nathaniel said, "She's going to want to dig. She's going to try to plant the lamb," Eliza said. Made that sound again, the rough, short thing that was his laugh, and she thought, that sound. I want to keep hearing that sound, which was perhaps the most ordinary wish she had ever had and felt like the most important one. There is something that happens in a life, not often and not on any predictable schedule, where you arrive somewhere and look around and understand that you are not passing through. That the thing you thought was temporary has become permanent not by decision exactly, but by accumulation. By all the small things you chose to do with your hands and your hours. By the relationships you let grow rather than keeping carefully at distance. By the moments you stayed when leaving would have been easier. Eliza Hartwell had left Georgia with 12 sentences and a suitcase, and the understanding that she was getting out of something she could not survive. She had not understood at the time that what she was also doing was getting into something. The train west was not only an escape but an arrival. That the man with the heavy handwriting was going to turn out to be the most honest person she'd ever known. That the child who didn't speak was going to become the most precise person she'd ever loved. The women in this valley, the June Olmsteads and the Adelaide Brennans and the Evelyn Marlowes, were going to be a kind of community she had not known she was missing because she had never had it before to miss. She had been so focused on surviving that she had not made room for the possibility of belonging. She had learned, what these months had taught her, in the specific and ungentle way that real things teach you, was this: belonging is not given to you. You cannot receive it passively. You build it the same way you build everything else worth having. By showing up, by using your hands, by being honest about what you have and what you need, by letting people help you when they offer, and by helping them back when you can. By doing the work when you're tired, by telling the truth when it's uncomfortable, by staying. That was it. That was the whole of it. Staying, when staying was hard, was how you earned the right to call something yours. She had stayed. She had worked. She had let this land and these people and this life matter to her, which was the bravest thing she had done. Braver than the letter she'd written at the kitchen table in Georgia. Braver than closing the door on Whitlock's face. Braver than riding into town with a satchel full of money and uncertain arithmetic. 'Cause letting things matter meant you could lose them. She had let it matter anyway. It was a Sunday in June warm, the first genuinely warm day of the year, when Rose came in from outside and found both Eliza and Nathaniel at the kitchen table. Not working, which was unusual enough that Rose stopped and looked at them. Eliza had a cup of tea, and Nathaniel had coffee, and they were simply sitting in the way of people who had been talking and had arrived at a comfortable quiet. Rose said, "You're not doing anything." Nathaniel said, "Correct." Rose looked at them with the expression she had when she was determining whether something was a problem or not. She decided it was not. She sat down in her own chair. She said, "Can I read you my story? You wrote another one?" Eliza said. This morning, Rose produced a folded piece of paper from her pocket. She kept things in her pockets, always in case they were needed, and opened it. Gah. She looked at them both, checking that they were paying attention. They were. She began to read. The story was about a woman who came to a strange land with one suitcase and had to learn everything new. In the story, the woman was afraid, but she didn't act afraid. And the land was cold, but it warmed up, and the people were strangers, but they didn't stay that way. At the end of the story, the woman looked out at the land she'd arrived in and thought, "This is mine. Not because anyone gave it to me, because I made it mine with my own hands." Rose finished reading. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket and looked at them both with the calm assurance of someone who knew the work was good. Nathaniel said, "That's your best one." "I know," Rose said. Eliza said, "Where did that ending come from?" Rose looked at her. She said, "From watching you." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the June morning was doing what June mornings did, in that part of Montana pressing warmth into every surface it could reach, coaxing things open. North pasture was fully green now. Garden plot above the creek bend had been broken the weekend before, Nathaniel and George turning the soil while Rose directed with the officious certainty of a child who has decided she is in charge of something. First seeds were in the ground. Eliza looked at Rose, and then at Nathaniel, and then out the window at the land that was theirs, not because anyone had given it to them, not only because they'd paid off the piece of paper that said they could keep it, because they had worked it and stayed on it, and made it the place where their actual life was happening, which was the only way any piece of earth ever really belonged to anyone. She thought about her grandmother's sewing needles in the tin at the bottom of her hat box, which were still there, still in the kitchen, still hers. She thought about the letter she'd written by candlelight that had brought her here. She thought about what she would say to the woman who'd written that letter, if she could. She would say, "You were right to go. You were right to stay. You were right about all of it, even the parts that scared you, especially those." She would say, "The life you couldn't imagine was the one waiting for you." She would say, "It wasn't perfect. It wasn't supposed to be. That's not what made it yours." She picked up her tea. The morning was warm, and the land was green, and Rose was already talking about whether she could plant the second row of the garden herself. And Nathaniel was saying she could, if she measured the spacing correctly, and Rose was saying she knew how to measure, and Nathaniel was saying he knew she knew, and the conversation went back and forth the way family conversations did. No particular destination, just the sound of people who had learned each other's rhythms and were comfortable inside them. Eliza sat in it. She let it be exactly what it was. Outside, somewhere in the south pasture, the lamb that had been born small and uncertain was fat and certain now, moving through the green spring grass of a Montana morning, belonging completely to the place where she had learned to survive. Some things, once they take root, do not let go.